In the early 1930s, before armored divisions thundered across Europe, a small formation existed whose duty involved protecting government ministries and the growing power structure of the new regime. The men carried rifles weighing roughly 9 pounds and marched through streets where political banners hung from balconies. Their numbers were modest, measured in a few hundred personnel tasked with security and ceremonial duties, rather than battlefield maneuver. Yet within a decade, that modest guard force expanded into a formation equipped with tanks weighing over 20 tons, artillery firing shells exceeding 20 pounds each, and armored vehicles consuming hundreds of gallons of fuel during sustained operations. The unit became known as the Hermann Göring Division, tied directly to the Air Force command structure, rather than the traditional army chain of command. The growth of the division mirrored the broader militarization of Germany during the late 1930s. Factories assembled armored vehicles using steel plates several inches thick, engines producing hundreds of horsepower, powered tanks capable of moving across mud, snow, and broken roads. Supply depots stored ammunition crates weighing dozens of pounds, and fuel drums stacked in rows that stretched across warehouses. By the time the Second World War erupted, the division had transformed into a mechanized formation capable of fighting alongside traditional armored units. Its soldiers trained with anti-aircraft guns, capable of firing shells at aircraft moving hundreds of miles per hour, as well as ground targets positioned miles away. Inside the turret of a panzer tank assigned to the division during early campaigns, the crew felt the engine rumble through the hull as the vehicle advanced across open terrain. The gunner aligned sights on distant shapes, while the loader lifted shells weighing roughly 15 pounds into the breach. Radio operators relayed coordinates to neighboring vehicles so that columns of armor could maneuver as a coordinated force rather than isolated machines. The division fought across multiple theaters during the war. In North Africa, its units collided with Allied forces in a desert environment, where heat pushed engines toward mechanical limits. Sand clogged filters and wore down moving parts. Trucks carrying fuel had to travel hundreds of miles from coastal ports to sustain armored units operating deep inland. In those desert battles, artillery units attached to the division fired shells weighing more than 20 pounds toward enemy positions. Tanks advanced across ground where visibility stretched for miles, making concealment nearly impossible. A column of armored vehicles raised dust clouds visible long before the machines themselves came into view. Later, the division redeployed to Sicily and Italy as Allied forces advanced through the Mediterranean. There, terrain changed dramatically. Narrow roads wound through mountains, where tanks weighing over 30 tons struggled to maneuver. Supply convoys carrying fuel and ammunition wound slowly through valleys vulnerable to air attack. Imagine a tank crew inside one of those vehicles, climbing a steep road in Sicily. The engine strains under the weight of steel armor plates several inches thick. The driver grips controls, while the commander scans ridgelines for aircraft or artillery observers. The division earned a reputation as an elite formation, receiving equipment and reinforcements often prioritized by high command. Yet reputation did not shield it from the broader pressures eroding German military capacity as the war progressed. Casualties accumulated. Battles across North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front consumed manpower at staggering rates. Infantry companies sometimes reported casualty levels exceeding 30 or 40% during intense engagements. Replacement soldiers arrived with limited training compared to veterans lost in earlier campaigns. Fuel shortages also intensified. German armored units required vast quantities of gasoline. A single tank could burn dozens of gallons during a day of maneuver. When Allied bombing campaigns struck synthetic fuel plants and transport networks, deliveries to frontline units diminished sharply. Tanks remained operational machines, but without fuel, they became stationary weapons. I remember studying logistical reports tied to armored divisions during the later stages of the war, and one pattern appears repeatedly. Operational tanks listed on paper, but unavailable for action because fuel reserves had fallen below required levels. Numbers on the roster looked impressive until you examined the column marked "Ready for Movement." Meanwhile, Allied forces deployed overwhelming industrial capacity. Factories in the United States produced tanks weighing around 30 tons, in quantities reaching tens of thousands over the course of the war. Aircraft factories assembled bombers capable of carrying loads measured in several thousand pounds. These bombers targeted rail yards, bridges, and fuel depots, essential for German armored formations. The Hermann Göring Division fought through these increasingly difficult conditions as the war shifted against Germany. In Italy, its soldiers defended mountain passes and cities against advancing Allied armies, supported by artillery barrages, firing thousands of shells per day. Inside a defensive position overlooking a narrow road, soldiers from the division might hear the distant rumble of approaching tanks, long before seeing them. The ground vibrated slightly with each movement of armored tracks against stone and soil. By 1945, the division had endured years of combat across multiple fronts. Equipment losses mounted. Experienced officers and non-commissioned officers had been killed or wounded in earlier battles. Reinforcements arrived younger and less experienced. When the war ended, the formation that once symbolized prestige within the German military system dissolved alongside the state it had served. When I read through after-action reports tied to the division's campaigns, I sometimes pause at the contrast between its beginnings and its end. A guard unit of a few hundred men evolved into a heavily armored formation, fighting across continents, only to erode under the weight of a war that demanded more resources than Germany could sustain. Picture a tank from the division sitting quietly beside a road in northern Italy during the final months of the war. The steel hull still bears scars from previous battles. The engine no longer runs because the fuel drums that once sustained it are empty. And if you are listening now, while the room grows quiet and the day begins drifting towards sleep, imagine those machines resting under a dark sky somewhere in Europe, their engines silent after years of combat. This is the entire history of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division in the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Policeman's Battalion. Berlin, February 1933. The birth of a political weapon. The 24th of February, 1933. Berlin. A Monday. The streets of the Kreuzberg district are still cold with winter, the pavements wet and gray under a sky that hasn't committed to either cloud or light. A police administrator sitting in the Prussian Ministry of the Interior signs a founding order, and 400 men begin to organize themselves into something Germany hasn't quite seen before. A security battalion answerable not to a police prefecture, not to the military chain of command, but to a single politician. The document is filed under Interior Ministry papers, not military records. That filing location is not an oversight. It is the first thing this unit tells you about itself, that it belongs to the political world, not the military one, and that its violence will wear a bureaucratic disguise. What's striking, when you sit with the records of this period, is how quickly the new state moved to redefine what a police unit was legally permitted to be. Hermann Göring had been appointed Prussian Minister of the Interior in February of 1933, the same month Hitler became Chancellor, and Göring used that position to do something precise and deliberate. He reached into existing Prussian police law and found a designation called ZBV, short for Zur besonderen Verwendung, meaning for special use. It was a pre-existing bureaucratic category that allowed a unit to be placed outside normal prefectural oversight and placed directly under a minister. Göring didn't invent this mechanism. He simply used it for a purpose its creators hadn't imagined. The new unit was named after its first commander, a veteran First World War officer and party member named Major Walter Wecke, and it was called the Polizeiabteilung ZBV, Wecke, the Wecke Special Duties Police Battalion. 400 men, 14 vehicles, billeted in a district that had voted more than 60% communist in the election of November 1932. The Kreuzberg location was not coincidental. Within 1 month of the unit's formation, its men were working alongside the Gestapo, also under Göring's authority at that time, conducting raids against communist and social democrat organizations in the working-class districts of Berlin. The records from this period, cross-referenced across police operational logs and political arrest registers, show a consistent operational pattern. Premises are identified, usually by Gestapo intelligence, and then physically raided by Wecke's men. The unit was, in its earliest form, a political enforcement tool dressed in police uniform. What's important to understand is that these weren't rogue operations. They were systematic. The arrest patterns are too consistent, too geographically concentrated, too tightly timed to be anything other than directed action. It fascinates me how historians discussing the origin of elite German military formations almost universally begin with 1935 or 1940, as if the years before didn't carry institutional weight. They do. The habits formed in Kreuzberg basements in 1933 did not simply disappear when the unit put on military uniforms. By June of 1933, the battalion had expanded enough to be reorganized under the Landespolizei, the state police structure, and renamed the Landespolizei Gruppe WW2. A detailed reading of the unit's progression through those first 12 months reveals something almost algorithmic. Every few months, a name change, an expansion, a slight increase in both the unit's size and its distance from any oversight mechanism that might constrain Göring's use of it. In January of 1934, it was renamed again, this time the Landespolizei Gruppe General Göring. The word general here is Göring's police rank, not a military title. That distinction matters because it means this unit was bearing Göring's personal name at least a full year before anyone outside specialist circles usually discusses it. The mythology of the Hermann Göring division tends to begin with the Luftwaffe years, with parades through Berlin and gleaming barracks. But the name was there, carrying weight, long before the military glamour. January 1934 also brought a significant political shift. Under pressure from both Hitler and Heinrich Himmler, Göring surrendered control of the Gestapo to Himmler's SS. This was not a voluntary concession. The evidence from contemporaneous ministry correspondence suggests Göring knew the transfer was coming and began expanding his remaining unit, the Landespolizei Group, as compensation before the ink was dry on the Gestapo handover. He was pre-positioning. He was using institutional survival instincts to protect his last remaining armed lever of personal power. The result was a unit that, by mid-1934, was militarily larger, more elaborately organized, and more politically anchored to its founder than almost any comparable police formation in Germany. And then came the summer. On the night of the 30th of June, 1934, Göring deployed his state police group alongside Himmler's Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler to execute the leadership of the SA, the Sturmabteilung paramilitary that Hitler had decided represented a threat to his authority. This event, known in German as the Rome Putsch and in English as the Night of the Long Knives, was the first time Göring's personal unit killed on political orders. The unit had been building toward this kind of action since February. The patrols, the raids, the bureaucratic engineering of autonomous authority, and now it carried them out in the starkest possible form. I want to be direct about this, because it matters for everything that follows. The formation that would eventually become an armored division fielding tanks in Sicily and the Eastern Front committed organized political killing in June of 1934. That is, the institution's foundation layer, not the gleaming parade ground, not the white-collar patches. The summer of 1934. What's interesting to me, when I trace the records through 1935, is the moment the unit crosses from the civilian administrative world into the military one. Göring was appointed commander-in-chief of the newly announced Luftwaffe in 1935, and he did not leave his favorite unit behind. In September of that year, the Landespolizei Group was formally transferred from the Prussian police structure to the Luftwaffe and renamed Regiment General Göring. The word general had by now shifted from a police rank to a military one. The unit's identity shifted with it, almost seamlessly, almost as if the transition had been planned from the beginning, which, in a real sense, it had been. What strikes me most in the archival record is the continuity of personnel across this transfer. The men who conducted political raids in Kreuzberg in 1933 were, in many cases, the same men now wearing Luftwaffe uniforms. The institution changed its clothes. The culture was the same. The regiment's establishment as of September 1935 included 2 Jaeger, light infantry, battalions, a motorcycle company, a pioneer engineering company, a cavalry platoon, and a signals section. It was, on paper, a conventional light infantry regiment. In practice, it was a prestige formation with a famous patron's name on its sleeve, billeted in Berlin, and tasked with guard duties at Göring's personal headquarters and at his private estate, Hall, named for his deceased first wife. The gap between the unit's ceremonial function and its political origin, between the white gloves at the changing of the guard and the Kreuzberg raids 2 years earlier, was enormous. Nobody in official documentation acknowledged that gap. The regiment's own early history, published by the unit's administrative staff in the late 1930s, begins with the Luftwaffe transfer, as if February 1933 hadn't happened. By the time the regiment stood guard at the German-Czech border during the Anschluss of Austria in March 1938, and later at the Skoda works in occupied Czechoslovakia, it had been performing the dual function that would define it for the next 7 years. Military-looking on the outside, politically grounded on the inside. The Skoda assignment is worth noting precisely because of what it says about institutional trust. Skoda was, at that moment, the most strategically important armaments manufacturing facility in Central Europe. The men assigned to guard it were, administratively, Luftwaffe airmen. They were the political unit of a politician who had decided, years earlier, that his personal power required a personal army. The war hadn't started yet. The implications of that arrangement had not yet been tested in anything resembling genuine combat. But the arrangement was already, in its architecture, something that would take years and thousands of kilometers of fighting to fully understand. In the records, the battalion that was born from a Monday morning police order in February 1933 fades gradually into the background of 1938 and 1939, transformed into something larger and louder and more militarily impressive. The name above the door changes. The new barracks in Berlin-Reinickendorf, more than 120 buildings, swimming pools, a military band hall, its own post office, replaced the cramped Kreuzberg billet. But somewhere in the filing cabinets of the Bundesarchives military collection in Freiburg, amid the post-war classification systems that sorted this unit firmly under military history rather than police history, the origin document sits, a founding order, a Tuesday stamp mark, 400 men, a political weapon looking for its first target and finding one, almost immediately, in the wet streets of a left-wing Berlin neighborhood. That is where this story begins. Chapter 2. From Collar Patches to Cockpits. The Luftwaffe Transfer. Berlin-Reinickendorf, 1935 to 1939. The Architecture of Prestige. Stand at the gate of what is now the Julius Leber Kaserne in the Reinickendorf district of Berlin on any given morning, and you'll see a working military installation, functional, modest, bureaucratic in the way that modern German bases tend to be. The name on the gate belongs to a social democrat who was executed in 1945, but the bones of the place are something else entirely. The buildings behind that gate were constructed between 1935 and 1936 for a specific, calculated purpose: to make the Regiment General Göring look, physically and institutionally, like it belonged in the company of Germany's most elite military formations. Over 120 buildings, indoor and outdoor swimming pools, multiple gymnasia, sports fields, a dedicated post office, a military band rehearsal hall large enough to accommodate a full regimental band with room for spectators. The construction cost, by one estimate, was approximately 18 million Reichsmarks, the equivalent procurement cost, at contemporary prices, of roughly 61 early-model Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter aircraft. Göring chose prestige architecture over fighter planes on behalf of his infantry regiment in 1935. That choice tells you something important about what this formation was actually for. The transfer of the unit from the Prussian police structure to the Luftwaffe in September 1935 coincided with Germany's public announcement of the Luftwaffe's existence. Göring was its commander-in-chief, and he brought his personal regiment with him into the new service branch, as if it were a piece of furniture from a previous apartment. The unit was renamed Regiment General Göring, a slight formality shift from the police designation, and its organizational structure was adjusted from a police establishment to a military one, with 2 Jaeger infantry battalions, a motorcycle company, a pioneer company, a cavalry platoon, and a signals section. The cavalry platoon, in a motorizing world, was already anachronistic, but the regiment wasn't designed primarily for tactical utility. It was designed to look like an elite formation and to sit at the intersection of political power and military prestige. The cavalry platoon suited the aesthetic. When I compare the regiment's intake criteria for the mid-1930s against those of the 2 other formations it was explicitly competing with, the Army's Infantry Regiment Gross Deutschland and the Waffen-SS Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the similarities are striking, and the differences are revealing. Like both competitors, the Regiment General Göring required applicants to be between 18 and 25 years old, German citizens, physically fit, Aryan by the race laws of the period, unmarried, and with a clean police record. Minimum height was 1.68 meters, 5 feet 6 inches in the old scale. But the General Göring added one criterion that was not merely implied in the other formations, but was explicitly printed on the intake form: confirmed open support for the National Socialist state. Not private belief, open, demonstrable, documentable support. The intake forms surviving in the Militär Archive in Freiburg carry a printed line below the standard physical assessment section: politische Zuverlässigkeit, political reliability, with two boxes: confirmed and not confirmed. On surviving forms from the 1936 intake cycle, not a single not confirmed mark has been recorded. Every single processed application that year was stamped confirmed. Every one. That is not a screening process. That is a document that tells you what kind of institution you are entering before you ask. The regiment's public life in these years was almost entirely ceremonial. The smartly dressed soldiers with their distinctive white collar patches and piping, the Waffenfarbe that placed them in no standard Wehrmacht branch, were a regular sight on Berlin's ceremonial routes. They provided the guard at Göring's personal headquarters, the changing of the guard performed with full ceremony and the regimental band in attendance. They lined the routes of state processions. They guarded Karenhall, Göring's private estate north of Berlin, where the Reichsmarschall kept an art collection that would eventually be understood as one of the most systematically looted in Europe. The regiment was, in these years, a showpiece, an institution that announced its patron's importance every time it stood at attention. Something important was happening simultaneously in 1936, however, and it happened with a consequence that nobody designing the regiment's ceremonial function had fully anticipated. The 1st Jaeger Battalion and the 15th Pioneer Company were assigned to the Doberitz Aviation School for parachute training. The regiment's best-trained infantry were sent, essentially, to learn to fall out of aircraft. By the end of 1937, these units had been redesignated as a parachute rifle battalion, and in March of 1938 they were formally detached from the regiment, sent to the training grounds at Stendal, and redesignated as the 1st Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 1, the first parachute infantry unit in the entire Wehrmacht. The men who would go on to lead Germany's airborne operations, some of the officers who would later assault the fortress of Ibn Email in Belgium in 1940, who would later take Crete, who would later hold Monte Cassino, came through this regiment's parade ground. By losing its most trained infantry to the paratrooper program, the regiment General Göring accidentally ceded the most effective light infantry arm Germany produced. Then it stood on a parade ground in Berlin while those men went to war. The regiment's participation in what the German press at the time called the Blumenkrieg, the Flower Wars, a sardonic name for bloodless annexations, gave it its first operational deployments without genuine combat. In March of 1938, 2 companies were airlifted by Junkers Ju-52 transport planes to Aspern Airport outside Vienna during the Anschluss. The men were among the first German military units to enter Austrian territory. They remained in the country for several weeks, garrisoning Wiener Neustadt. In October of that year, the regiment participated in the annexation of the Sudetenland. In March of 1939, it entered the rest of Czechoslovakia and was assigned to guard duty at the Skoda works. The sequence, Vienna, Sudetenland, Prague, Skoda, reads as a tour of Central European strategic landmarks. The regiment was present at every major German territorial advance of the late 1930s. It fired almost no shots during any of them. The regimental order of battle on the eve of actual war in September 1939 was a peculiar hybrid. On one side, 4 flak artillery batteries, including heavy batteries equipped with the 88mm gun, and multiple light and medium anti-aircraft batteries. On the other, a guard infantry battalion with 3 companies and a cavalry squadron, an ersatz training battalion, and a searchlight battalion. The unit was, in the simplest terms, a flak regiment that had an infantry component attached, plus a ceremonial guard function and a political identity. None of these elements had been designed to work together in sustained ground combat. The flak crews were trained for aircraft. The infantry were trained for guard duties and ceremonial precision. The searchlight operators were trained for night aerial observation. Nobody had written a combined arms tactical doctrine that unified these elements, because nobody had designed this regiment to fight as an integrated unit. It was designed to look unified. It was designed to project Göring's personal prestige in the most militarily plausible form available. I find myself returning, in the documentary record for this period, to a particular detail about the regiment's cuff title, the Armelstreifen that carried the name Hermann Göring on the lower left sleeve of the uniform. The cuff title system in the Wehrmacht placed units in a visual chain of identity that every other soldier could read at a glance. The SS had their titles. The Grossdeutschland had its title. The Regiment General Göring had its title. Wearing it placed the unit in an implicit peer group with Germany's most famous formations. But the title also did something else. It placed the unit in a legal, administrative gray zone. The white collar patches and piping indicated a unit that belonged to neither the Standard Army nor the Standard Luftwaffe in any conventional functional sense. This gray zone gave Göring maximum flexibility and minimum army oversight, which was, of course, precisely the point. The title was not just a piece of woven fabric, it was an institutional claim. By 1939, the regiment had approximately 14,000 men in its various elements. It had a military band that performed on ceremonial routes through Berlin. It had new barracks with swimming pools. Its soldiers were taller than average, unattached, and politically screened. And it was about to go to war, most of it staying home to guard a radio headquarters, while a small detachment went to Poland for what amounted to a brief administrative deployment. The contrast between the regiment's physical impressiveness and its operational weight at the beginning of the war is one of those details that you need to sit with. Over 120 buildings, 18 million Reichsmarks, 120 buildings for a regiment that, in September of 1939, mostly stayed in Berlin. The architecture of prestige had been built. The architecture of military competence had not yet begun. Chapter 3. The Dress Rehearsals. France, Norway, and the Art of Anti-Tank Fire. May to June 1940, when a flat crew discovers what it's actually good at. The 10th of May, 1940. The German offensive in the West begins before dawn, and the Regiment General Göring, or most of it, has been sitting on the German-Dutch border for weeks under camouflage designations. Flak Regiment 101 and Flak Regiment 103, fictitious unit names designed to obscure Göring's personal formation from Allied intelligence. In Denmark, a detachment under Hauptmann Klug had already been operating for several weeks following the April invasion of Scandinavia, seizing airfields and radio stations at Esbjerg, then transferring to Oslo, then advancing north along the Norwegian coast, all the way above the Arctic Circle toward the port of Bodo and beyond. Men from a Berlin ceremonial regiment in white-collar patches, riding motorcycles through Norwegian snow. It's one of the more incongruous images in the unit's history, and it almost never appears in accounts of the campaign. The regiment was already at war before the Western offensive began. It was simply at war in a place nobody was paying attention to. The Norway operation matters for what it reveals about the regiment's actual operational flexibility, not its ceremonial identity, but its practical capability under field conditions. Kluge's detachment was composed of a guard infantry company, a light self-propelled anti-aircraft battery, and the motorcycle company. These were not men trained for Arctic mountain operations. They were trained for standing smartly at gates and providing parade ground ceremony. Yet, in April and May of 1940, they advanced through southern Norway alongside army units, crossed by sea to Trondheim, and then moved north through difficult terrain to relieve pressure on elite mountain troops. Gebirgsjäger, who had been cut off near Narvik. The detachment performed competently, not spectacularly, competently. When the Allied evacuation of Norway began in late May, precipitated by the disaster unfolding in France, the pressure on Narvik eased, and Kluge's men returned to Berlin. But they'd been tested in genuine field conditions, which was more than most of the regiment could say. The Battle of France, which opened on the 10th of May with the main German thrust through Belgium and the Ardennes, involved the bulk of the regiment in roles consistent with its mixed identity. Anti-aircraft batteries were attached to leading panzer divisions as mobile air defense and indirect fire support. Guard infantry companies participated in the crossing of the Maas River and the breaching of the Albert Canal under real resistance. The regiment crossed into Belgium with Army Group B and participated in the advance toward Brussels. Brussels fell on the 17th of May and continued south and west into France. For a formation that had spent most of the previous 4 years on ceremonial duties, the pace of the campaign was a revelation. The French and Belgian armies collapsed faster than anyone had planned for. The regiment found itself advancing through country that hadn't had time to organize a serious defense. Then, somewhere in the forest of Mormel, in the flat agricultural country of northern France, probably in the third week of May. The precise date is noted in the regimental war diary, with more certainty than I want to overstate here. Something happened that altered the unit's self-understanding permanently. The 3rd and 5th batteries of the regiment, equipped with the 88mm flak gun and deployed in direct support of a panzer thrust, were caught by a French armored counterattack. Conventional anti-tank weapons couldn't stop the French heavy tanks. The Char B-1 heavy tank carried 60mm frontal armor that the standard German 37mm anti-tank gun of the period couldn't reliably penetrate. The flak crews made a decision. They depressed the barrels of their 88mm guns to the minimum elevation, technically outside the carriage's rated stress envelope for ground fire, and engaged the French armor at direct fire. The guns Cassar and Dona, named in the regimental war diary, destroyed 18 French tanks. At their closest engagement, the distance between gun barrel and target was 15 meters. The regimental war diary entry recording this action was written in a different hand from the surrounding entries, as if a senior officer had gone back and added it formally. The word held, gehalten, is underlined twice. The 88mm flak 18 was not designed for this role. Its barrel assembly weighed 1,530 kilograms. When depressed to anti-tank angle on soft forest soil, the lateral stress on the carriage was outside the weapon's design specifications. The shell, which left the muzzle at approximately 820 meters per second, covered 15 meters in roughly 18 thousandths of a second. At that range, the impact was essentially perpendicular to the tank's side armor, and the penetration was geometrically certain. What the flak crews discovered in those minutes in the forest of Mormal was that their weapon, used in a way that violated its doctrine, was the most effective anti-tank tool on the Western Front. Not by design, by accident, desperation, and the specific physics of an 88mm shell at close range. The regiment's campaign in France proceeded through May and into June without a single engagement of the dramatic clarity of the Mormal forest moment. Anti-aircraft batteries remained attached to panzer divisions, engaging aircraft when aircraft appeared and engaging tanks when tanks appeared. The infantry companies fought in a supporting role, crossing rivers and securing flanks. The regiment took casualties. These were real combat operations, not parades, but it performed adequately across all its assigned functions. On the 21st of June, 1940, France formally surrendered, and the instrument of armistice was signed in the same railway carriage in the Compiègne forest clearing, where Germany had signed the 1918 armistice. The Regiment General Göring provided part of the honor guard. Göring had personally arranged for the ceremony to use that specific location and that specific railway carriage. The regiment that had been born as a political instrument stood guard at a moment of political theater on a scale that dwarfed anything its founders had imagined in 1933. The men with white collar patches stood at attention, while the symbolism of the First World War's ending was formally reversed. The regiment was returned to Berlin at the end of 1940 to resume its guard and air defense functions. Colonel Paul Conrath had taken command in June of 1940, the man who would lead the formation through its transformation into a division and through the pivotal campaigns in Sicily and Italy. Conrath was a career officer who was, by most accounts, genuinely competent at the regimental and later divisional level. He was not a Göring political appointee in the sense of being promoted beyond his ability by personal favor alone. He had commanded the regiment's anti-aircraft elements in France and had learned, at first hand, what the unit's guns could do when used in ways their design hadn't specified. What he received command of was a regiment returning from its first real combat experience with one major confirmed tactical capability: direct fire anti-tank work with the 88, and a list of unresolved questions about everything else. The regiment was now, in the Wehrmacht's eyes, a combat formation. Whether it was a coherent one was a different question. What I find most instructive when I work through the accounts of the 1940 campaign is the gap between what the regiment was designed to be and what it discovered it was good at in France. It was designed to be a prestige infantry formation with air defense capability. It discovered, in the forest of Mormal, that it was potentially one of the best anti-armor flak forces in the German military. These are not the same thing, and the gap between them, the gap between what an institution thinks it is and what it turns out to be capable of, is one of the defining tensions of everything that follows. The Mormal Forest engagement entered regimental legend immediately. It was underlined in the war diary, It was cited in after-action reports. It became the origin story of the unit's combat identity. But the regiment's institutional infrastructure, the barracks, the guard duties, the ceremonial function, the political patronage, remained unchanged. The discovery of what the guns could do didn't transform the regiment into a tank-killing force. It just gave the regiment a story to tell about itself. By the spring of 1941, the regiment had been motorized and redesignated Regiment Motorized, Hermann Göring. It was moved to Romania for possible attachment to operations in the Balkans, then held in reserve for the air defense of the Ploesti oil fields, a strategic asset so important that Göring would not commit his personal unit to the infantry fighting in Yugoslavia and Greece. The regiment guarded oil. Then it moved east to the Bug River, the boundary between German and Soviet occupation zones in Poland. June of 1941 was approaching. The drill grounds and the swimming pools of Berlin-Reinickendorf were very far away. Chapter 4. Barbarossa's Edge. The Flak Regiment at Brody and Kiev. June to December 1941. A hybrid formation meets a continental war. The 15th of June, 1941. 7 days before the invasion of the Soviet Union. The regiment, motorized. Hermann Göring is positioned along the Bug River as part of the 2nd Flak Corps attached to Panzergruppe von Kleist and its order of battle document for that date. A typed organizational table that survives in the military archive contains a single handwritten addition at the bottom of the column. In German, Ersatz für Esten Abteilung noch ausstehend, replacement for the 1st Battalion still outstanding. Before a single shot was fired on the Eastern Front, the regiment's own paperwork acknowledged that it was deploying with a listed deficiency. On the 22nd of June, 1941, this regiment crossed the Bug River into Soviet-occupied Poland with an outstanding replacement request already in its administrative record. The gap between what the document described and what physically existed was the regiment's permanent condition. It would not close for 2 years. The order of battle that day is worth sitting with, because it reveals the regiment's fundamental structural contradiction more clearly than any narrative account could. On the heavy artillery side, 12 88mm guns and 3 batteries, capable of depressing to anti-tank angle against Soviet armor. On the light side, multiple batteries of 37mm and 20mm flak guns, primarily designed for low-altitude air defense. And then, occupying a completely separate logistical category, a rifle battalion of infantry companies and a motorcycle company, requiring food and small arms ammunition, not flak shells or spare barrel assemblies. 3 distinct logistical chains, 3 distinct maintenance requirements, 3 entirely different equipment profiles, all under one regimental command, all attached to the 11th Panzer Division as supporting elements rather than operating independently. The regiment going into Russia wasn't a combined arms formation in any design sense. It was a collection of useful capabilities that happened to share a name and a political patron. The first days of Operation Barbarossa played to the regiment's specific strength. Attached to the 11th Panzer Division for the breakthrough advance through Army Group South Sector, the regiment's flak batteries performed the same anti-tank improvisation that had worked in France, depressing heavy barrels against Soviet armor in the initial breakthrough past Radziekov. But the Soviet Union, in 1941, presented a problem that France in 1940 had not: the T-34 medium tank and the KV-1 heavy tank. The KV-1 carried up to 90 millimeters of frontal armor. The standard German 50mm PaK-38 anti-tank gun, at anything beyond close range, could not penetrate it. The 88mm round, at 1,000 meters, could penetrate approximately 100 millimeters of vertical armor plate, just barely more than the KV-1's maximum frontal thickness. The margin was 10 millimeters. In wet conditions, at non-perpendicular impact angles, that margin could drop to near zero. The flak crews weren't invincible. They were operating at the absolute engineering boundary between success and catastrophe. At the Battle of Brody at the end of June, the massive armored engagement in the Ukraine that involved more tanks on both sides than any engagement yet seen in the war, the regiment fought as part of the 11th Panzer Division's operations against Soviet armored forces that briefly encircled the German formation. The flak batteries were critical to breaking through the encirclement, again in the direct anti-tank role. The 88mm gun had now proven its anti-armor capability in 3 separate campaigns: Spain, where it was first used this way, France, and now Russia, and the regiment had been present for 2 of those 3. What strikes me when I read through the operational records of these summer weeks is how the regiment's most competent function was consistently the one it had been designed least to perform. It was a flak unit that kept being asked to stop tanks. Every time it was asked, it succeeded. And every time it succeeded, its fundamental organizational incoherence was masked by one specific capability that happened to be extraordinary. The Battle of Uman, in early August, produced the regiment's most decorated individual action of the Eastern Front campaign. A Soviet breakout attempt by night ran directly into the 16th Battery, designated Battery Rossmann for its commander, Oberleutnant Karl Rossmann, which was holding a static defensive position supported by a small infantry contingent, including troops from the SS Division Viking. Rossmann's battery, fighting in darkness against infantry rather than aircraft or armor, held its position and prevented the breakout. He received the Knight's Cross on the 12th of September, 1941. What I find worth noting, and what is almost never emphasized in the accounts, is that Rossmann was a flak battery officer, trained to operate height-finding equipment and range calculators for aerial targets. He ended the Uman action as the most decorated man in the regiment. He'd never, by the account of the available records, directed effective anti-aircraft fire against an actual aircraft during his entire Eastern Front service. The regiment's most celebrated early hero was, by any functional measure, not a flak officer at all. He was an infantryman who happened to be standing at a flak battery position when the infantry function was required. The regiment participated in the encirclement of Kiev in September, the largest single encirclement battle in military history, resulting in more than 660,000 Soviet prisoners, in the supporting role of flak coverage for the armored spearheads. Then, in the autumn, it moved to the Battle of Bryansk, which unfolded through October as German forces pushed deep into central Russia. The regiment took significant casualties in these operations, enough to require the withdrawal of the main regimental elements back to Germany at the end of 1941 for rest and rebuilding. The Rifle Battalion remained at the front until May of 1942, and a newly formed 2nd Rifle Battalion, raised to replace the losses, was sent east and almost immediately destroyed in defensive fighting around Juknau and Anisovo Gorodicha. The German regimental records list approximately 340 killed, wounded, or missing for this battalion in that period. Soviet operational records for the same sector suggest the actual figure was closer to 510, a discrepancy of 170 men that most likely reflects Luftwaffe administrative personnel counted as non-combat losses rather than combat casualties, falling through the gap between two record-keeping systems that weren't designed to acknowledge each other. The logistical reality of the Eastern Front campaign exposed the regiment's structural contradiction in ways that France hadn't. Each 88mm gun at maximum sustained fire rate consumed approximately 98 kilograms of ammunition per minute in the direct fire role. The regiment's ammunition supply column, rated at 25 tons total capacity, could carry enough heavy flak rounds for approximately 4 hours of sustained fire across all 12 heavy guns before requiring resupply. In a fluid advance, resupply convoys were typically taking 18 to 24 hours to complete their cycle. The supply officer knew, before the first gun was fired in Russia, that sustained ground combat would exhaust the flak arm before it could be replenished. The flak batteries that seemed invincible at Brody and Uman were operating against a logistics clock that nobody had designed them to beat. When I was working through the fuel and ammunition logs for the regiment's summer operations in Ukraine, cross-referencing them against the attached Panzer Division's records, I kept finding the same pattern. The regiment was effective in the sharp, short engagements, a breakthrough here, a blocking action there, where its specific anti-armor capability could be concentrated briefly and then withdrawn before the supply constraint became critical. In sustained operations, the hybrid nature of the unit began to show its costs. The infantry companies needed one resupply chain. The heavy flak batteries needed another. The light batteries needed a third. The regiment's operations staff was managing 3 different logistics systems simultaneously, in a theater where logistics was already the dominant operational constraint. This is the thing that the Mormal Forest story and the Uman Knight's Cross story obscure. The regiment's tactical brilliance was real, but it was operating inside an organizational structure that was quietly accumulating problems with every kilometer of the Eastern Front it covered. The regiment returned to Germany at the end of 1941, carrying something more valuable than any decoration, a regimental culture that had been tested, that had found its specific competence under fire, and that had survived its first serious campaign intact. But it also carried the unresolved question of what it actually was. It wasn't a flak regiment. Its best work had been ground combat. It wasn't an infantry regiment. Its organic infantry element had been nearly destroyed. It wasn't a panzer formation. It had no tanks. It was, after 18 months of actual warfare, still the same institutional hybrid it had been in September of 1940. The swimming pools at Reinickendorf were waiting. So was a different kind of war, and a different kind of question. Chapter 5. Building the Division, the Transformation. 1942 Germany, May to November 1942, when ambition outpaces preparation. The spring of 1942, the regiment, Mo. Hermann Göring is back in Germany, being rebuilt after its Eastern Front losses, and a bureaucratic argument is happening in a series of offices between the Luftwaffe's High Command, the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, or OKL, and the Army's General Staff that will determine the shape of every operation the unit fights for the next 3 years. The argument is about what kind of formation the regiment should become. The Army General Staff position, put simply, was that if the Hermann Göring formation was going to be expanded to division size, it should receive Army standard training, Army standard doctrine, and Army personnel in its key technical positions, especially in the Panzer Arm, where the learning curve for crew competence was the steepest and the consequences of ignorance were most immediately fatal. Göring's position was recorded in a memorandum annotation from March of 1942, in which he wrote, "Meine Division wird von meinen Männern geführt. My division will be commanded by my men." The word mine appears twice in 3 lines. The memo is in the OKL files in the Bundesarchiv. I've read versions of that institutional argument before, in other armies, in other eras. It never ends well for the men on the ground. Between May and July of 1942, the regiment was expanded to brigade size and redesignated Brigade Hermann Göring under General Major Paul Conrath. This was not a simple paper exercise. It required substantial additional manpower, new equipment categories, and a genuinely new command structure. But the manpower source was the problem. The Army's Panzer Arm was already stretched across the Eastern Front. Sending experienced panzer crews and NCOs to fill out a Luftwaffe-branded formation was not something the Wehrmacht's personnel office would do willingly. What the Army would send, and what was agreed upon in the compromise of late 1942, were advisors and instructors, not the permanent backbone of trained crew that a panzer division actually required. The experienced men would teach, the Luftwaffe volunteers would learn. The question was how much time that learning would take, and how much time was actually available. The expanded formation became the Division Hermann Göring in October of 1942, absorbing approximately 5,000 additional Luftwaffe volunteers and Fallschirmjäger personnel alongside its existing brigade structure. The division's authorized strength as a panzer division stood at 14,727 men and 147 tanks. The core of its armored element was the Panzer IV Ausführung G, the long-barreled 75mm variant that was, by mid-1942 standards, a genuinely capable tank against most Allied armor. The crews receiving these tanks were not, for the most part, Army Panzer veterans. They were Luftwaffe personnel who had gone through an abbreviated conversion course. The Wehrmacht's standard Panzer crew training program ran 6 months. 3 months of vehicle mechanics and maintenance, 2 months of driving and gunnery, 1 month of combined arms tactics. The abbreviated course used for HG's Luftwaffe conversions ran approximately 6 weeks, covering basic vehicle operation and elementary gunnery. Mechanical maintenance, the 3 months of instruction that Army crews received, and that represented the difference between a tank that fought and a tank that sat in a ditch, was largely omitted. The OKH assessment of the division's readiness, written in November of 1942, when deployment to Tunisia was being ordered, rated the formation bedingte kampfbereit, conditionally combat ready, the second lowest rating on the Wehrmacht's 4-tier scale. Conrath's own post-war account, written for the United States Army Historical Division in the early 1950s, describes the division as substantially combat ready at the time of deployment. These two assessments cannot both be fully accurate. What the contemporaneous OKH document describes, and it was written by officers with no personal interest in flattering Göring, is a formation with significant gaps in its technical training that might be acceptable if deployed carefully in a supporting role with time to develop. What Göring's political timetable actually provided was immediate deployment, without support, to one of the most logistically demanding theaters in the war. The OKH was right. Conrath, decades later, either remembered differently or chose to. The division's first full complement of armored vehicles included both Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks drawn from Army replacement pools, plus a number of vehicles that had been repaired and returned from earlier campaigns, with their mechanical histories intact and their maintenance demands well understood, by Army mechanics who would not be accompanying them to Tunisia. The vehicles were functioning. The crews who would maintain them were undertrained. This specific combination, good machines, undertrained handlers, is one of the most reliable predictors of operational failure in mechanized warfare, and it was built into the division's structure in the autumn of 1942 by a combination of political pressure and genuine manpower constraints. It was also, in principle, fixable with time. Time was what wasn't available. When Allied forces landed in northwest Africa on the 8th of November 1942, Operation Torch, the American and British landings in Morocco and Algeria that transformed the Mediterranean strategic situation overnight. The strategic logic of having an untrained panzer division sitting in Germany evaporated. Heeresgruppe Africa needed reinforcements immediately. Elements of the division Hermann Göring began shipping to Tunisia within weeks of the landings. The formation would complete its training in combat, in Africa, against experienced Allied forces. This is the military education system that Göring's insistence on his men had produced. A division deployed before its training was finished, to a theater it hadn't prepared for, with maintenance untrained crews driving vehicles they barely understood in terrain that was specifically hostile to the one thing that would kill them fastest: engine failure. I find myself, when working through the 1942 records, wondering what a different version of this decision looks like. Not a fantasy version, not one where the unit gets the 12 months of proper training it needed, but a minimal version where Göring accepts the Army advisors as permanent cadre rather than temporary instructors, where the 6-week maintenance course is at least extended to 12. That version might have saved 31 tanks in Tunisia, 31 tanks that weren't destroyed in combat, 31 tanks abandoned in the Tunisian desert for mechanical failures in the final days of the campaign, by crews who didn't have the skills to fix them. That's not a small number. The 31 abandoned tanks represent the physical form of the training shortcut, the mechanical consequence of 6 weeks instead of 6 months. By the time the division's advance elements arrived in Tunisia in late November and December of 1942, they were entering an operational environment that was already under severe logistical strain. Allied naval and air forces had been interdicting Axis Mediterranean supply lines since the autumn, and the disruption was systematic. During the 5 months from November of 1942 to May of 1943, Allied forces sank approximately 230,000 tons of Axis shipping in the Mediterranean. By a reasonable reconstruction estimate, somewhere around 34% of what was shipped to the HG division during this period never arrived, lost to submarines or air attack. Every third convoy was at the bottom of the sea. The division was arriving in a theater where the supply chain was already failing, with equipment it didn't fully know how to maintain, just as German military power in North Africa was entering its final contraction. The combination was not survivable. Chapter 6. The Sand Crucible, Tunisia, 1942 to 1943. November 1942 to May 1943. Learning under fire, dying underprepared. The 14th of December 1942. A supply request, filed by the division. Hermann Göring's Quartiermeister officer in Tunisia, sits in the records of Heeresgruppe Afrika, bearing the classification dringend benötigt, urgently required. The document lists 47 separate equipment items. Item 3, 40 complete track link assemblies for Panzer IV tanks. Item 7, 1,200 liters of hydraulic fluid for gun traverse mechanisms. Item 31, 400 pairs of replacement boot soles. The request is signed and countersigned in proper military form. At the bottom, there is no response notation, no stamp of approval, no forwarding reference. Nobody in the supply chain formally answered it. The document was filed, and then it sat, and the boots kept wearing through, and the hydraulic fluid kept running low, and the tracks kept breaking. Somewhere between the urgency of the filing clerk's typing and the silence at the other end of the supply chain lay the operational reality of what the division Hermann Göring's first independent campaign actually was. The division arrived in Tunisia in fragments rather than as a coherent formation. Advance elements reached Tunis in late November, just weeks after the Allied landings, and were immediately committed to defensive operations in a theater where the Axis position was already being defined more by what it lacked than by what it had. The 10th Panzer Division, a veteran army formation with experienced crews and established maintenance disciplines, was the dominant German armored force in Tunisia, and the HG elements arriving alongside it were immediately visible as something different in character. A period forum discussion among historians, drawing on Feldgrau research published as early as the 1950s, describes the HG's Tunisia formation as poorly trained and made up of various Luftwaffe personnel with limited combat experience. That assessment aligns precisely with what the maintenance records reveal. The HG's non-battle tank losses from engine failure and mechanical breakdown were running at approximately double the rate of veteran Army Panzer units in the same operational sector by March of 1943. The specific mechanical failure mode was predictable and documented. The Panzer IV Ausführung G was powered by the Maybach HL 120 TRM engine, a 12-cylinder petrol unit producing approximately 265 horsepower. In the fine grit dust environment of Tunisian desert operations, the engine's air filtration system required cleaning at intervals of approximately 8 to 10 hours of running time. An Army Panzer crew, trained in the 3-month maintenance curriculum, could complete this cleaning procedure in approximately 45 minutes. 2 men, the right tools, a practice sequence of steps. An HG crew trained in the abbreviated 6-week curriculum was taking 2 to 3 hours for the same task, if they attempted it at all. Skipped filter maintenance in fine Tunisian dust led to accelerated engine wear, which led to engine seizure, which led to tanks stopping in the field, not in battle, in transit, on roads, abandoned because the crews didn't have the knowledge to identify the failure early enough to prevent it, and didn't have the skills to fix it once it occurred. The campaign through the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943 was not the absolute disaster that a summary might suggest. The division fought, it took ground, it defended positions. When the Tunisian perimeter contracted and the 10th Panzer Division conducted its sharp operations at Kasserine Pass in February, inflicting a significant tactical defeat on American forces and demonstrating what a veteran panzer formation could accomplish with proper training and leadership, HG elements were present in the area as reserves and flank security, not in the leading role. The difference between what the veterans of the 10th Panzer achieved at Kasserine and what the HG was doing on the flanks was educational for every HG officer watching. Several of Conrath's subordinate commanders noted explicitly in internal reports that the 10th Panzer's movement and coordination represented a standard the HG division had not yet reached. The logistical context for all of this fighting was deteriorating throughout the campaign. By February of 1943, the Allied naval and air interdiction campaign against Axis Mediterranean shipping had become so effective that the German and Italian forces in Tunisia were receiving, on the best days, perhaps 30 to 40% of their required daily supply allocations. Fuel was rationed, ammunition was prioritized for artillery over armor. Tank crews were being asked to conduct operations on fuel loads that represented half a day's movement, then return to depot for resupply, which could take 24 hours or more to complete. The division that was already struggling with maintenance was now operating on compressed operational timelines, driven by fuel shortages that had nothing to do with the quality of its training. The supply failure compounded the training failure in ways that made it difficult to isolate, which was the greater cause of the division's difficulties. There is one supply record detail that I keep returning to when I think about the Tunisia campaign. In the reconstruction of Allied Mediterranean interdiction statistics, the estimate is that approximately 34% of supplies shipped to the HG division in this period never arrived, roughly 1 in 3 convoys. What that number doesn't capture is the quality distribution of what was lost versus what arrived. The heaviest, most urgently needed items, tank replacement parts, specialist tools, hydraulic components, were in the most concentrated shipping packages, which were the highest value targets for Allied submarines. Lighter materials, basic rations, clothing, those were more likely to arrive. The result was a division that, by March of 1943, had enough food to feed its men, but not enough hydraulic fluid to maintain its vehicles. Soldiers in Tunisia were adequately fed while sitting next to tanks that couldn't traverse their turrets. The collapse of Army Group Africa in May of 1943 produced the most brutal balance sheet of the Tunisia campaign. The bulk of the division, Hermann Göring, was evacuated to Sicily before the final surrender, but the division left behind approximately 4,200 men killed, captured, or missing in the campaign. More significant for the division's future, it left behind 31 tanks abandoned for mechanical failure, not combat losses, mechanical abandonments. Brand new vehicles, in some cases, machines that had arrived in Africa fewer than 3 weeks before the campaign ended, crews who had never taken them into battle. They stood in the desert because nobody could fix them. The Tunisia campaign had been, for this formation, something close to a controlled experiment in what happens when an undertrained division is deployed into an unforgiving theater before its training is complete. The results were documented in Italian in the Tunisian Sun, and they were not ambiguous. What the survivors carried back to Sicily, however, was something the training programs hadn't provided and the organizational structure hadn't planned for: experience. The crews who had fought in Tunisia, who had nursed failing engines across desert roads and improvised anti-tank screens from flak batteries and watched the 10th Panzer Division work, those men understood mechanized warfare in a way that no 6-week course could have taught them. Tunisia was expensive. It was badly managed at the institutional level. It revealed every structural weakness Göring's political interference had built into the division. But it also produced, among the survivors, a cohort of tankmen and artillerymen and infantrymen who had learned their trade the hardest possible way. Sicily was 6 weeks away. The division that landed there would be smaller, more battered, and more uncertain than the one that had shipped to Tunisia. It would also be, at the crew and company level, considerably more competent. The question was whether 6 weeks of reorganization in Sicily was enough time for that competence to become something the division could act on. It very nearly was. Chapter 7. The 6-week division. The counterattack at Gela. Sicily, July 10th to 11th, 1943. The 10th of July, 1943, 02:45 hours. An armada of more than 3,200 Allied vessels sits in a sea that has been churned for 2 days by winds gusting to 35 knots, and the landing craft going in are taking on water before they reach the beach. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division has been on Sicily for approximately 6 weeks, rebuilt from the Tunisia wreckage, still short of its authorized strength of 14,727 men. Its tank crews, representing a patchwork of Tunisian veterans and recent Luftwaffe conversions, who've had less than 2 months together. The division's Panzer Regiment at this point fields 2 standard tank battalions and 1 assault gun battalion, plus the attached 2nd Company of Schwere Panzer Abteilung 504, bringing 17 Tiger I tanks to the formation, each Tiger weighing 57 metric tons, each carrying the long 88mm KWK-36 gun, each presenting 100mm of frontal armor plate to anything that tried to stop it. The combined weight of those 17 Tigers alone was 969 metric tons. Sicily's rural road network, built for civilian horse traffic and agricultural vehicles, had not been engineered with 969 metric tons of armor in mind. That gap between the weapon's capability and the terrain's capacity would define the next 37 days. During the night of the 9th and 10th, American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division were scattered across a wide area by storm winds, landing nowhere near their intended drop zones. From Conrath's command post, the overnight intelligence reports made no coherent sense. Small groups of paratroopers here, a roadblock there, a radio station reporting contact somewhere else entirely. The fragmented picture meant that by the time the amphibious landings began at 02:45, Conrath didn't have a clear read on where the Allied weight was actually concentrated. He knew the landings had come. He didn't know exactly what he was facing or where the American main effort was being pushed inland. This uncertainty is recorded in the division's own war diary for the 10th, which notes multiple conflicting reports and the difficulty of distinguishing scattered paratrooper actions from the leading edge of a main beach assault. For a division sitting as the island's primary mobile reserve, this was the worst possible opening condition. The need to act quickly against a situation that the intelligence picture refused to clarify. Conrath's counterattack plan called for 2 armored columns moving simultaneously. The larger effort would drive south toward Gela from the north, using both tank battalions with the Tigers in support, aiming to strike the American 1st Infantry Division's beachhead before it had time to consolidate. A secondary effort would push toward the Licata area in the west. The Italian Livorno Division was supposed to be coordinating on the German left flank, advancing its infantry to protect the armor's exposed side. General Guzzoni, commanding the Axis forces on Sicily, had specifically ordered that the 2 attacks, German armor and Italian infantry, be synchronized before launch. This was not an unreasonable tactical requirement. An armored thrust without infantry on its flank is vulnerable to anti-tank guns placed in defilade off the main axis of attack. At approximately 6:15 hours on July 11th, Conrath sent his launch message. "Attack is running. Expect success," logged at the receiving headquarters at 6:22. The Livorno division had not moved. Its infantry wasn't in position. The left flank was open. Conrath had gone anyway. The lead tank elements pushed south across the flat Gela plain. The terrain here offers almost nothing by way of cover. A coastal shelf of farmland, occasionally broken by shallow gullies, with the beach and the sea visible from the high ground where the panzers were coming down. Colonel William Darby's Rangers were in the streets of Gela itself, tough, trained soldiers who'd spent the previous 18 months developing their skills in North Africa and Sicily. The street fighting in Gela on the morning of July 11th was not the clean advance of armor through infantry that the plan described. It was Darby's men using bazookas and 37mm anti-tank guns at ranges measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, shooting at tank running gear and optics from behind buildings and through doorways. At some point in the mid-morning chaos, Darby himself and his driver, a soldier named Carlo Contrera, joined the fight directly, manning weapons alongside the Rangers, not commanding from a distance. The regimental commander of one of the American Army's elite formations was personally in the street battle. The German tanks were that close. Then, USS Boise opened fire. The Boise was a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, displacing approximately 12,242 tons at full load, carrying 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets, with a sustained fire rate of approximately 6 rounds per minute per gun across the full battery. She had been positioned offshore, specifically to provide call fire support for the ground forces. When the gunnery officer brought the main battery onto the Gela plain, each 6-inch round weighed 47 kilograms and arrived carrying a blast radius of approximately 15 to 20 meters. The shells weren't designed to penetrate tank armor. They were naval rounds, designed for use against ships' superstructures and shore installations. But the blast effects at near-miss range against a Panzer IV were sufficient to strip external optics, jam turret rings, damage running gear, and, according to HG's own post-action medical reports, cause concussion injuries classified as Erschütterungsschäden in approximately 34% of crew casualties recorded for July 11th. You didn't need to put a hole in the tank. You needed to make it impossible for the crew inside to think. What the American 1st Infantry Division's after-action report establishes, and this matters because it complicates the most common retelling of the battle, is that German armor was still visibly advancing as late as approximately 1:45 in the afternoon, more than 3 hours after the Boise had opened fire. Conrath called the attack off at approximately 1400 hours. That is not a formation broken by the first naval salvo. That is a formation that pushed through sustained heavy fire for 3 hours, reached a point where the lead tanks were within roughly 800 meters of the waterline, and then withdrew on a command decision rather than being physically stopped. 800 meters. That is the distance between the outcome that actually happened and an outcome that might have destroyed the Allied invasion timetable in the Mediterranean by months. I find that distance one of the more quietly startling facts in the entire documentary record of the Sicilian campaign. The Allied beachhead was not saved because the HG couldn't reach it. The HG came very close to reaching it. The Tiger tanks attached from SPZABT 504 participated in the Gela fighting and demonstrated precisely the tactical frustration that the terrain had advertised. At combat ranges up to approximately 500 meters, the Allied 57mm anti-tank gun could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. The gun simply didn't have enough velocity at those ranges. The Tiger was, against every direct-fire weapon the 1st Infantry Division had at Gela, essentially immune frontally. Yet 14 of the 17 Tigers that arrived on Sicily were lost during the campaign. 14 out of 17, an 82% loss rate representing the Tiger I's worst single-campaign attrition in any theater of the war. They were destroyed not by weapons that could penetrate their frontal armor, but by naval gunfire blast effects stripping their running gear, by road infrastructure that rated bridges below 30 tons and couldn't carry 57-ton vehicles, by mechanical breakdowns in terrain their designers hadn't planned for. The weapon was technically invulnerable to what was shooting at it. That invulnerability turned out not to matter. What wasn't in the operational picture, what the surviving documents only gesture at, is the texture of the German crew's experience during those 3 hours under fire from the Boise. A 6-inch naval round, striking within 15 meters of a Panzer IV, creates a pressure wave that crews describe as a physical impact from every direction simultaneously. The tank doesn't move significantly from a near miss. It absorbs the blast, while the men inside absorb the shock of it. Crew accounts from other campaigns in similar conditions describe ringing ears that lasted days, confusion about what was happening outside the vision blocks, the disorientation of being in a vehicle that isn't destroyed but feels like it might be. The crews kept advancing for 3 hours in those conditions. Whatever their institutional failings in Tunisia, whatever the training shortcuts that Göring's political interference had built into the division's preparation, the men in those tanks on July 11th kept going forward until they were told to stop. Conrath called the attack off at approximately 1400 hours. The afternoon entry in the division's war diary records the withdrawal and lists casualties without editorial commentary, a standard operational notation in the flat language of military record-keeping. The single-line attack message sent at 6:15, "Attack is running, expect success," was now paired with 7 hours and 38 minutes of war. The gap between those two entries contained the closest the Axis forces ever came to stopping the Allied Mediterranean strategy in its tracks. It also contained the moment when every structural weakness that Göring's institutional vanity had built into the division, the abbreviated tank crew training, the lack of proper coordination with Italian forces, the dependence on an armored thrust unsupported on its flank, expressed itself tactically in the most unforgiving arena available. Gela was both a near-miss victory and an illustration of what the formation could and couldn't do. It would spend the next 4 weeks demonstrating the second half of that equation with considerable more effectiveness. The Gela counterattack is remembered, understandably, as the day the Hermann Göring division nearly destroyed the Allied invasion of Sicily. What gets less attention is the coordination failure that made it preventable. Conrath went without the Livorno infantry. The left flank was open. The naval guns had a clear field of fire across an exposed plain. Had the attack launched 2 hours later, with Italian infantry in position on the German left, the armored push might have arrived in a configuration that forced the American defensive line to split its attention rather than concentrate it. Whether that would have been enough to push through the naval gunfire is unknowable. What's not unknowable is that it wasn't attempted. The failure at Gela was not simply a military failure. It was a failure of coordination between partners who didn't trust each other enough to wait 30 minutes, let alone 2 hours. That pattern, of the HG operating as if coordination with adjacent forces was optional, would appear again in subsequent campaigns. Sicily was the first time it cost them a beachhead they might otherwise have taken. Chapter 8. Withdrawal in the Sun, the Sicilian Retreat. July 12 to August 17, 1943. The 12th of July, 1943, the day after Gela. Across the Sicilian road network, elements of the Hermann Göring division are reorganizing, pulling back from the plain, redistributing what fuel remained, accounting for the tanks left behind and the crews that came back without them. The division's war diary for July 12th records a formation that is battered but not broken, moving into a defensive posture while the scale of the Allied landing becomes clearer hour by hour. What was coming into focus for every German commander on the island was the arithmetic. 360,000 Allied troops were ashore or coming ashore, supported by a naval fire umbrella that had just demonstrated its effect against the best armored force the Germans could field in Sicily. Conrath's division, at its July 11th strength, numbered perhaps 11,000 combat-effective personnel, with fewer than 70 operational tanks. The tactical question was no longer whether the HG could push the Allies into the sea. It was how long the division could make the island expensive before the evacuation order came. Kampfgruppe Schmalz, the HG's battle group on the Eastern Axis, built around Oberst Wilhelm Schmalz's command, entered the fighting on July 11th itself, conducting its first delaying actions against the British Eighth Army's advance from the south toward Catania. This is important context. While the gala drama was playing out on the western side of the island, Schmalz was already doing on the eastern road what the whole division would eventually spend 5 weeks doing everywhere on Sicily. He held positions for 24 to 48 hours, then disengaged under cover of darkness to the next natural choke point, a bridge, a defile, a village on high ground above the road. The British 13th Corps, advancing north on the coastal axis, was using Montgomery's standard approach: methodical probing, artillery preparation before any major assault, a reluctance to drive hard into positions whose strength hadn't been established. Schmalz's diary entry from around the 17th of July, the one noting the Lentini position and the observation that the English are methodical, you can plan around methodical, captures something operationally true. The British Army in 1943 was exceptionally professional and thoroughly capable. It was also predictable in its methods, in a way that a skilled rearguard commander could turn into a tool. The Etna Line, which the Axis defenders established from approximately the 20th of July, used the geography of Mount Etna as a defensive anchor, in a way that forced Allied commanders to attack on narrow fronts, where artillery preparation was constrained by the same terrain that made the defense strong. Mount Etna is not a small feature. It rises to 3,329 meters, its flanks creating terrain that is impassable to vehicles across most of its eastern slope. The passable corridors were few, and the Germans held them with forces that were disproportionately small relative to what they were stopping. HG units held portions of the Etna line with company and platoon strength groups, sometimes as few as 40 to 60 men with machine guns, mortars, and a handful of anti-tank weapons dug into prepared positions. An Allied division pushing into that kind of terrain needed to clear each position individually, at the cost of time and casualties, before moving to the next. The rearguard's leverage against a much larger force came not from matching firepower, but from the mathematics of terrain. One man in a good position is worth 15 in the open. What I find genuinely striking, when I compare the Etna Line performance against the Gela counterattack, is how completely different the two engagements feel institutionally. At Gela, the division attacked without proper coordination, exposed its flank, and came within 800 meters of success, while making errors that competent staff work should have prevented. On the Etna Line, the same formation held sophisticated defensive positions with small forces, timed its withdrawals with precision, and imposed delays on the Eighth Army that repeatedly threw off Montgomery's operational timetable. The HG wasn't a good attacking division in Sicily. It turned out to be, when the terrain and the mission aligned, a genuinely effective defensive formation. This is the thing the formation's later reputation obscures. The unit's best work in 1943 was retreat, not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because the specific capabilities the formation had developed, reading terrain, moving at night, holding briefly, and then disengaging before encirclement, were exactly what defensive operations required, and not quite what offensive operations demanded. By the 27th of July, the Axis commanders on Sicily had concluded that evacuation was the only realistic outcome. Field Marshal Kesselring reported to Hitler on the 29th that holding the island was no longer feasible. Operation Lehrgang, the organized Axis evacuation across the Strait of Messina, was planned and began execution on the 3rd of August. The crossing points were covered by what was, by the summer of 1943, one of the most concentrated anti-aircraft belts in the war. Approximately 500 guns of various calibers positioned on both the Sicilian and Calabrian shores, creating overlapping fire zones over the 3-kilometer strait. Allied air forces flew approximately 2,912 sorties against the crossing points during the operation. They lost 13 ferries and barges out of the fleet making the crossing. Statistically, Each Allied sortie failed to prevent the movement of the equivalent of approximately 13 tons of Axis personnel and materiel. The Allies had overwhelming air superiority over Sicily. They did not have overwhelming air superiority over a well-defended 3-kilometer strait. The HG Division's own flak batteries, the crews who had first earned the regiment's combat reputation at the Forest of Mormal in 1940, who had learned to shoot at tanks in Barbarossa and had been improvised into infantry support at Uman, were among the units providing anti-aircraft coverage for the evacuation crossing. There is something almost circular about this. The regiment had been born as an anti-aircraft formation, had spent 4 years discovering and developing its ground combat capabilities, and was now, at the end of its Sicilian campaign, performing its original function as an anti-aircraft shield. The 1,400 rounds per minute output of a properly sighted 20mm flak battery against low-flying attack aircraft made the crossing corridor genuinely dangerous for Allied pilots, and the cumulative effect of 500 guns doing the same job created a threat environment that made sustained interdiction missions prohibitively costly. The old skill was still the best skill. Between August 11th and 17th, the bulk of the Wehrmacht forces on Sicily crossed the strait. The final total of German materiel evacuated was 39,569 troops, 9,065 vehicles, 27 tanks, 94 heavy guns, 1,100 tons of ammunition, and 970 tons of fuel. The tank number, 27, is worth pausing on. 17 Tigers had arrived in Sicily for the campaign. 14 were lost during it. Of the 3 that survived, how many made it across the strait in August is not entirely clear from the records. The remaining evacuated tanks were Panzer IVs and assault guns from the HG's own armored regiment, representing the vehicles that had survived both the Gela fighting and the subsequent 5 weeks of defensive operations. Included among them were vehicles that had been repaired in the field during the withdrawal, stripped of parts from abandoned tanks, patched with improvised fixes, kept running by crews who'd learned their maintenance skills not in any training school, but in the necessity of a campaign that punished ignorance with immobility. The 16 days of the Lehrgang operation are one of the less examined episodes in the Sicilian narrative, which tends to focus on the invasion's opening days and the Gela engagement. The neglect is understandable from an Allied perspective. The evacuation was an Allied failure of interdiction, and military histories don't linger on their own failures unless compelled. But from the perspective of understanding what the Hermann Göring Division actually was by August of 1943, the evacuation is central. The formation that crossed the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy was not the same division that had arrived on Sicily in late May. It had lost thousands of men in Tunisia and thousands more in 37 days of Sicilian fighting. It had lost most of its Tigers and a substantial fraction of its Panzer IVs. What it had gained, what no abbreviated training program could have provided, and what Göring's institutional engineering hadn't designed for, was a cohort of veterans who understood their weapons, their terrain, and their opponents in a way that only sustained combat produces. The swimming pools at Reinickendorf hadn't built that. Sicily had. The last German soldiers left Sicily at 06:35 on the 17th of August, 1943. General Hube reported from Calabria that Operation Lehrgang was complete. Somewhere in that final crossing, in the darkness over the Strait of Messina, the formation that had been born as a police battalion in a Berlin-Kreuzberg district in February of 1933 became, definitively, a war-experienced armored division. The experience had cost it enormously. It had also, perversely, made it considerably more dangerous. Italy was waiting. Chapter 9. The Italian War. Salerno to the Winter Line. September to December 1943. Up the ladder. The 9th of September 1943. Salerno. Operation Avalanche begins at 03:30 hours with American and British forces going ashore at a beach that the German 10th Army has had weeks to study, plan around, and prepare defensive positions behind. The day before, Italy had announced its surrender to the Allies. General Eisenhower's announcement over Radio Algiers on the evening of the 8th had caught several German formations in the middle of operational repositioning, but not all of them. The Hermann Göring Division and the 16th Panzer Division were already positioned as mobile reserves behind the likely landing zones on the Tyrrhenian coast, and when the landings came on the 9th, they were ready. Within hours of the first Allied soldiers hitting the beach, German armor was moving toward the beachhead from multiple directions. By the end of the first day, the German forces had established contact with the Allied perimeter at multiple points and were probing for weaknesses. The Salerno campaign had begun in the same way the Gela counterattack had ended. German armor pressing hard at Allied soldiers who hadn't had time to consolidate, on a coastal plain where naval gunfire was the critical variable. The crisis that developed over the following 5 days is documented in Mark Clark's Fifth Army records, with a specificity that post-war accounts sometimes soften. Between September 12th and 14th, German forces, including HG elements alongside the 26th Panzer Division and others, penetrated the Allied perimeter at multiple points and drove to within 3 kilometers of the beach at the deepest points of advance. Clark's personal diary from this period records the consideration of evacuation contingencies. The official U.S. Army history of the Italian campaign, Salerno to Cassino, published by the Center of Military History, notes that by the evening of September 14th, plans to evacuate the beachhead were no longer even being considered, which is a precise way of documenting that they had, in fact, been considered. The Salerno crisis was real, the evacuation planning was real, and the thing that broke the crisis was the same thing that had broken the Gela counterattack: naval gunfire. Allied warships fired approximately 11,000 rounds of naval ordnance during the September 12th through 14th crisis period. 11,000 rounds. A combined shell weight approaching 1,500 metric tons delivered onto a beachhead perimeter that was, at its most dangerous moment, roughly the size of a city neighborhood. There is a specific organizational detail about the Salerno fighting that doesn't appear in most popular accounts, but that matters for understanding what the HG actually was at this stage. The division was not the primary German formation driving the Salerno counterattack. The 16th Panzer Division carried much of the initial assault, and several other German formations were committed as the crisis deepened. The HG was one of 6 divisions that the official history identifies as participating in the coordinated German counterattack of September 12th through 14th. This context is important because it means the division was operating as part of a German combined arms effort, rather than as an isolated formation making independent decisions, which is, in fact, where it performed best. When the HG had proper flank cover and a coordinated operational framework, when it wasn't being asked to improvise a major assault with insufficient infantry and no time for preparation, it could function as a competent component of a larger operation. Gela had shown what happened when coordination was bypassed. Salerno showed what happened when it wasn't. The Italian peninsula's geography now imposed itself on the campaign in ways that would define the next 18 months of fighting. The Apennine Mountains run the length of the peninsula, and the rivers draining east and west from the central spine cross the Allied axis of advance at roughly even intervals. The Volturno, the Garigliano, the Rapido, and many smaller waterways in between. Each river line was a natural defensive position, requiring deliberate attack to breach. Each ridge between river lines was a potential rearguard position that could delay an advance by a day or several days. The Germans called this approach to defensive withdrawal a Stufenabwehr, a stepped defense, and it was exactly suited to the terrain of central Italy. A relatively small force could hold each step for long enough to force a set-piece Allied attack, extract itself before being outflanked, and occupy the next step 10 kilometers further north. The Hermann Göring Division was one of the formations practicing this technique through the autumn of 1943, and it was learning, under operational pressure, to do it well. The division's tank force in this period was being used in ways that bore almost no resemblance to the mobile armored warfare that Panzer doctrine described. The Panzer IVs were increasingly deployed hull down in static positions, their turrets projecting above ridgelines or embankments, their hulls protected, operating as direct-fire artillery platforms for infantry positions, rather than as maneuver elements. A hull-down Panzer IV presents approximately 1.8 square meters of visible target area to an enemy anti-tank gun, compared to approximately 7.5 square meters in a fully exposed position. The reduction is not trivial. It means that at 500 meters, a gunner trying to hit the exposed turret has roughly the same difficulty as hitting a doorway from the length of 4 football pitches. Schmalz's post-war notes from this period explicitly acknowledge that hull-down employment was something HG crews learned during the Sicilian withdrawal, rather than in training. It was now being applied systematically in Italy, and the difference between a crew that knew how to use terrain and one that didn't was frequently the difference between a vehicle that survived and one that didn't. On the 6th of January, 1944, the division received its new designation, Fallschirm Panzer Division, Hermann Göring. The parachute qualification, Fallschirm, was Göring's addition to the divisional title, designed to associate his formation with the Fallschirmjäger arm, whose reputation was at its peak following the defense of Monte Cassino. The HG had no parachute-qualified personnel, no airborne equipment, and no airborne mission. The 1st Jaeger Battalion that had gone to parachute training in 1936, the unit that had become the seed of the entire Fallschirmjäger arm, had left the regiment 8 years earlier. What Göring was doing with the January redesignation was borrowing the prestige branding of an arm that his own regiment had accidentally created and then lost, applying it to a formation that had no functional connection to the airborne tradition the branding invoked. From the perspective of the men fighting in the mountains of central Italy, the name change made no operational difference. From the perspective of understanding how institutional identity was being managed at the strategic level, it is a nearly perfect document of the gap between Göring's symbolic world and the actual war. I've spent considerable time with the Winterline documents, the Fifth Army operational records for November and December of 1943 that trace the grinding advance against German positions across the mountain ridges above the Volturno River. The U.S. Army Center of Military History's published account of the Winterline campaign contains a specific reference to an HG Panzer Division infantry counterattack launched at 22:10 hours against American positions, with 3 infantry companies committed from the northwest. 3 companies, roughly 350 to 400 men attacking at night, as part of the defensive sequencing that kept the Winterline tenable for nearly 2 months against a force with overwhelming material advantages. What strikes me about this specific detail isn't the tactical mechanics, it's the scale. The division that had been conceived as a showcase formation, staffed with men screened for political reliability, and housed in an 18 million Reichsmark complex with indoor swimming pools, had been reduced by operational necessity to fighting at company level, at night, in the mountains, as part of a defensive arrangement whose strategic outcome nobody in the formation could be in any doubt about. The Italian campaign confirmed several things about the division that the Sicilian experience had suggested. In a defensive role, in terrain that channeled Allied advances into predictable corridors, with proper flank coordination and adequate time for preparation, the HG could function as a genuinely capable formation. In an offensive role requiring rapid coordination with adjacent forces across uncertain terrain, the structural gaps that Göring's political interference had built into the division's preparation expressed themselves as tactical failures. The Winterline fighting also confirms something about the Italian civilian population's experience of the HG's presence, though this requires a different chapter than operational analysis can contain. The mountains of central Italy were not simply a battlefield. They were inhabited by people whose experience of the Hermann Göring division extended beyond the tactical level into areas that the divisional war diary's operational language was never designed to describe. The transfer order for the Eastern Front came in mid-July of 1944, pulling the division from Italy after approximately 12 months of continuous fighting. It had been in action from Sicily in July of 1943 through the Winter Line, the Gustav Line, the fighting withdrawals north of Rome, the Trasimene Line, 12 months of Italian warfare that had shaped the formation's operational culture in ways that both enhanced its defensive competence and embedded a pattern of rear area conduct that the following chapter examines. The division that left Italy in the summer of 1944 was a battle-hardened armored formation by any conventional military measure. It was also, by the measure of the Italian judicial record, something else entirely. Chapter 10. The Burning Villages. War Crimes in Italy. Spring-Summer, 1944. What the Archive Requires. The 18th of June, 1944. A Sunday evening. A farmhouse near the small hamlet of Madonna, close to the hill town of Civitella in Val di Chiana, in the Arezzo province of Tuscany. 9 German soldiers, identified in survivor testimony as members of the Hermann Göring division, approach the farmhouse. Italian partisans, who have been using the area for meetings, are present. What exactly happens next is not established with absolute precision, but the outcome is 2 German soldiers are killed, 1 is wounded. The partisan group escapes into the countryside. For the next 11 days, nothing visibly changes in Civitella or the nearby villages of Cornia and San Pancrazio. The towns continue their routines. People observe Mass on the following Sundays. The local market continues. Children play in the piazza. And then on the 29th of June, a Thursday, another Mass day, at dawn, soldiers from the WW2 alarm company of the Hermann Göring Panzer division enter all three villages simultaneously. They separate the men from the women and children. In Civitella, the men are taken to the church in groups of 5. 744 people are killed across the three villages. Several buildings are set on fire with people inside them. The 11-day gap is the first thing that demands explanation. In the immediate emotional logic of wartime violence, a reprisal following a partisan action makes a grim kind of operational sense, a cruel arithmetic that the Wehrmacht had formalized in policy. An 11-day delay is something different. 11 days is long enough for the fear to have eased, long enough for the population to have concluded that the killing of 2 soldiers would not produce a systematic response, long enough for Sunday Mass to feel safe again. The archive at Civitella, the Archivio della Memoria Civitella in Val di Chiana, preserves testimony and documentation about the days between June 18th and June 29th that describes a community in a state of anxious but incomplete uncertainty, not a community locked in anticipatory terror. The 11-day gap was not the product of administrative delay or command uncertainty. A 3-village, simultaneous dawn operation requires prior planning, communication, and coordination across at least a battalion-level command. Someone planned it in the 11 days. Someone chose the date. Someone chose to do it on a Sunday morning. The alarm company WW2, the WW2 Alarm Company, carries a designation that Schmalz's defense at his post-war trial exploited carefully. An alarm company is, by Wehrmacht doctrine, an improvised unit assembled from rear area service personnel when no frontline troops are available. Cooks, drivers, mechanics, signals staff, men classified as non-combat effective, who are handed weapons and assigned to a defensive or security task. The argument ran, an improvised unit assembled from rear area service personnel and acting under conditions of emergency was not organically under divisional command in the way a regular rifle battalion was. Its actions could not be attributed to Schmalz's command decisions in the normal sense. This argument is legally coherent in its narrow form. It is operationally implausible in the specific context of Civitella. A company of rear area cooks and drivers cannot organize a synchronized dawn assault on 3 separate villages at the same moment without direction from a command element with operational planning capability, radio communications, map references, timing coordination, and someone with the authority to commit the unit to the specific targets at the specific time. The alarm company was the weapon. It was pointed and fired by a hand the acquittal record doesn't name. The documentation assembled by the NS Tater in Italian Research Project, a systematic German-Italian collaborative effort drawing on Italian judicial records, captured German documents, Allied military investigation files held at the National Archives in London under reference WO204, and survivor testimony, identifies the massacre as a Hermann Göring division operation, with a specificity that the post-war Italian court denied access to the key operational orders stored in the Armadio della Vergogna, could not fully establish. The research maps the sequence: the partisan action on June 18th, the German unit's acknowledgement of casualties, the period of planning, the dawn operation on June 29th, the consistency of the operational pattern, simultaneous village entry, separation of male civilians, killing at the church, burning of buildings, with the pattern documented at other HG reprisal sites in the Arezzo province through the spring and summer of 1944, suggests a shared methodology that cannot have been independently invented by separate subunits operating without coordination. Methodology requires instruction. Instruction requires a source. In the summer of 1944, in the Arezzo province, German troops drawn primarily from the Hermann Göring division killed approximately 744 people at Civitella, Cornia, and San Pancrazio on June 29th, and additional hundreds in other operations across the province through July and into August. The total civilian death toll attributable to the division across its Italian deployment, as documented in Italian judicial and academic records, stands at approximately 1,000. representing roughly 1/3 of all civilian deaths in German war crimes across the entire Italian campaign. The HG was in Italy for approximately 9 months. It accounted for 1/3 of the total atrocity death toll across a campaign lasting more than 18 months, involving dozens of German formations. The proportionality of that figure is not explained by the HG's relative combat weight in the theater. It requires a different kind of explanation. The broader pattern that Gerhard Schreiber documented in Deutsche Kriegsverbrechen in Italian, published by C.H. Beck in 1996, covers not just Civitella, but the wider sequence of HG reprisal operations across central Italy. The pattern has consistent characteristics. Partisan or resistance action triggers a response within 24 to 72 hours. The response targets the nearest accessible village population rather than the partisan group itself. Male civilians are separated from women and children, and the killing is conducted with a methodological consistency that implies a shared understanding of procedure across multiple separate incidents. Schreiber's analysis concludes that this consistency reflects divisional-level command direction, not spontaneous actions by individuals, but a systematic approach to anti-partisan operations that was transmitted through the command structure and replicated across the division's area of operation. The post-war German counter-argument that the killings were spontaneous acts by individual soldiers acting outside orders does not survive comparison with the pattern the records document. I want to be direct about something here, because the records require it. When I compare the accounts in the Veterans Association publications, which describe the Italian campaign in terms of tank positions, defensive lines, and fighting withdrawals, against the Italian judicial documentation for the same geographical area and the same time period, the gap between the two accounts is not a matter of emphasis or perspective. The veterans' publications describe one war. The Italian records describe another war happening simultaneously, in the same mountains, to people who were not combatants. These aren't competing narratives of the same event. They are accounts of different categories of experience that were produced by the same institution, in the same place at the same time. Holding them together, reading the daily war diary entry alongside the Italian magistrate's deposition about the same day and the same location, is what the archive requires, and what the Veterans Association literature spent 40 years ensuring its readers didn't have to do. The Armadio della Vergogna, the cupboard of shame, was discovered in a Rome basement in 1994 by investigative journalist Franco Giustolisi. It contains 695 files documenting alleged German war crimes in Italy, including files relating to operations attributable to the Hermann Göring Division. These files had been assembled by Allied military investigation teams in 1944 and 45, transferred to Italian military judicial custody, and then filed face down in a metal cabinet in 1960, rather than forwarded to prosecutors. The year 1960 is significant. It falls in the middle of West Germany's rearmament as a NATO member, and the period of Western European integration that made prosecuting German war crimes politically inconvenient for the Italian government. The cabinet was not sealed by German officials protecting their own. It was sealed by Italian government administrators protecting a diplomatic relationship. The victims of Civitella, their families, the survivors who had given testimony to Allied investigators in 1945, had their cases filed in a basement, not by the perpetrators, but by the state that had promised to seek justice for them. General Wilhelm Schmalz, acquitted in Rome on the 12th of July, 1950, died in 1983 without facing further proceedings. General Paul Conrath died in 1979. The men of the Vesuve Alarm Company, who entered Civitella at dawn on June 29, 1944, have been dead for decades. What the archive holds is testimony and documentation that was preserved by the persistence of survivors, investigators, and, eventually, researchers who understood that the operational history of an armored division cannot be complete if it is silent about what that division did to the population living in its operational area. The 744 dead at Civitella, Cornia, and San Pancrazio on one Thursday morning in June were not a footnote to the Italian campaign. They were what the Italian campaign looked like from the inside of the villages through which the Hermann Göring Division passed. Chapter 11. Reborn as a Corps. The expansion of October 1944. Warsaw to East Prussia, when the paper outweighed the army. The 1st of October, 1944. Germany has lost France. Operation Bagration has destroyed Army Group Center, eliminating approximately 30 divisions in 2 months, the single largest military catastrophe the Wehrmacht had yet experienced. The Vistula River, where Soviet forces have established bridgeheads at multiple points, is the eastern boundary of whatever remains of German strategic depth in Central Europe. Allied forces are pushing against the western German border. Fuel production from the synthetic fuel plants at Luna and elsewhere has been catastrophically disrupted by Allied strategic bombing, and the Wehrmacht's daily fuel allocation to frontline units is running at roughly 20 to 25% of operational requirements. On this day, the 1st of October, 1944, Hermann Göring signs an 8-page formation order, properly formatted, correctly countersigned, establishing the Fallschirm Panzer Corps Hermann Göring. The document specifies authorized strengths, assigns command relationships, details supply chain responsibilities, and sets out the Corps headquarters organization with the precision that German military administrative culture brought to every formal act. It does not specify where the additional 26,000 men required to bring the Corps to establishment would come from. That question was never addressed in the document. The document was not written to answer operational questions. It was written to create an institutional fact. The Hermann Göring Division had arrived on the Eastern Front in late July of 1944, transferred from Italy to the Warsaw area as Soviet Army Group Center's summer offensive continued to push westward. The timing placed the division in the area of the Polish capital exactly as the Warsaw Uprising began on the 1st of August. A coincidence of operational geography that placed the HG in the outer cordon around Warsaw, while SS and police formations suppressed the uprising from within. The division fought at Radzimin in early August, a German armored counterattack north of Warsaw, conducted alongside the SS Division Viking and the 19th Panzer Division, which temporarily stabilized a section of the Soviet advance, and is documented in standard operational records as conventional combined arms fighting. The division's presence in the Praga district of Warsaw during the uprising period is confirmed by Polish Home Army intelligence reports, which identify HG soldiers by their distinctive white-collar piping in the eastern Warsaw area. What specifically occurred in Praga during August and September, beyond the documented conventional military operations against Soviet forces east of the Vistula, is not established with the same documentary clarity as the Italian record. This chapter does not claim a certainty the evidence doesn't support. The 2nd Fallschirm Panzer Grenadier Division HG, the formation created to complete the Corps, deserves the specific attention that its composition commands. Its infantry regiments were assembled from Luftwaffe field training battalions, whose parent schools had been closed as Germany's Air Force contracted to a fraction of its 1942 size. From surplus aircrew, pilots and observers grounded because no aircraft remained to fly them. From Luftwaffe base security personnel stripped from airfields across occupied Europe that were being abandoned as Germany retreated, and from a transfer cadre from the 1st HG Division's replacement training battalion. These men were assigned to a Panzer Grenadier Division, mechanized infantry in doctrine, as if the designation itself conferred capability. Several of the battalions constituting this formation had been servicing aircraft on French airfields in the summer of 1944. Their infantry training, in the standard Wehrmacht sense, was either absent or years out of date. The cuff title was issued. The name Hermann Göring was on the sleeve. The formation existed as a Panzer Grenadier Division on every administrative document the Corps produced. I find myself returning, in the October 1944 records, to the fuel mathematics that underlay every operational decision the Corps ever made. A Panzer Corps at full operational establishment, 2 divisions with their organic artillery, supply, and headquarters elements, required approximately 180,000 liters of fuel per day to sustain standard movement and combat operations. The Wehrmacht's fuel allocation system in October 1944 was distributing fuel to frontline corps at approximately 15 to 25% of authorized daily requirements, driven by the Allied bombing campaign against synthetic fuel plants that had reduced German fuel production to a fraction of the 1943 baseline. The HG Corps was receiving, on a good allocation day, somewhere between 27,000 and 45,000 liters. It was authorized 180,000. On the day the Corps was formally created, the 1st of October, 1944, it was born operationally paralyzed, not by the enemy, by arithmetic. The Corps headquarters in December of 1944 had an actual personnel strength of approximately 1,244, against an authorized establishment of 4,847. 26% of the staff required to command 2 divisions in combined operations. The communications section, which should have operated 12 dedicated command radio vehicles, each carrying a FUG-7 set with a 70-kilometer range and requiring a 3-man operator team, had 4 vehicles and 9 operators. This meant the Corps could maintain reliable simultaneous communications with one of its 2 subordinate divisions at a time, in favorable atmospheric conditions, on clear frequencies. An armored corps that cannot talk to both its divisions at once cannot coordinate their operations. Coordination is what makes a corps, rather than 2 separate divisions sharing a map reference. The HG Corps was, in December of 1944, functionally a regimental headquarters with an inflated title. The institutional absurdity of the October formation order sits alongside a genuine military tragedy. The men in the HG Corps at the end of 1944 were not paper soldiers. They were veterans, many of them, who had fought from Sicily through Italy and through the first months of the Eastern Front, carrying experience that had been paid for in the hardest available currency. The framework around them was the institutional vanity project of a man who was simultaneously losing his grip on the Luftwaffe, his influence with Hitler, and his understanding of the war Germany was fighting. Göring, in October of 1944, was not the Göring who had signed the February 1933 police order. He was a man whose primary military command, the Luftwaffe, had failed to defend German cities from Allied bombing, and whose credibility within the Wehrmacht's senior leadership had been destroyed by his repeated promises and failures. The Corps creation was not a strategic military decision. It was an act of institutional self-preservation, the last available mechanism for keeping a personal military force in being under a famous name, at a moment when the war was consuming every institutional structure the Reich had built. Heinz Guderian's post-war memoir, Panzer Leader, describes a confrontation with Göring over the employment of the HG Corps in late 1944, in which Göring allegedly insisted the Corps be held as a strategic reserve, rather than committed piecemeal. OKH operational records for the same period show the Corps committed to frontline defensive operations almost continuously from October onward. These 2 accounts cannot be reconciled. Either Guderian's memory of specific conversations is imperfect, or Göring was articulating one policy to Guderian and implementing a different one through the operational chain. The gap between what Göring said and what the Corps actually did is consistent with a pattern visible throughout the formation's history: the rhetoric of elite reserve status, the operational reality of a frontline unit plugging gaps as they opened. The difference between 1935 and 1944 is that in 1935, the gap between the rhetoric and the reality was a source of institutional pride. By October of 1944, it was a source of operational irrelevance. The Corps was deployed in East Prussia and the Vistula region through the autumn and early winter of 1944, fighting in the continuous defensive operations that the strategic situation required, and receiving the continuous supply shortfalls that the logistical situation guaranteed. The Fallschirm Panzer Corps War Diary for this period is a document of a formation permanently below strength, permanently short of fuel, permanently responding to crises it hadn't the resources to prevent. The entries have a rhythmic quality: a defensive position held, a counterattack by insufficient forces, a withdrawal to the next line, a request for fuel and ammunition that arrives at partial allocation, that reads, "Once you've been through enough of them," as the bureaucratic notation of institutional exhaustion. January of 1945 was 3 months away. When it came, it would not arrive as a surprise. It would arrive as arithmetic. Chapter 12. East Prussia, The Mathematics of Collapse. January to February, 1945, when the fuel ran out. The 15th of January, 1945. The Fallschirm Panzer Corps War Diary, a typed fuel allocation entry for that day. Authorized allocation, 48,000 liters. Actual received, 6,200 liters. And in the margin, in pencil, in a hand that is smaller and more compressed than the surrounding typewritten entries, as if whoever wrote it was conscious of the contrast between the size of the number and the size of the problem it described. Sprit reicht für 12 Stunden Bewegung, fuel sufficient for 12 hours of movement. 3 days after the Soviet Vistula Oder offensive had begun. 3 days into the largest single military operation in history. The armored corps that was theoretically part of Germany's response to that offensive had enough fuel to move its vehicles for half a day. Not 12 days, not 12 weeks, 12 hours. The pencil note doesn't carry visible emotion. Operational diaries don't. It simply establishes the number, and the number does the rest. The Vistula Oder offensive launched on the 12th of January 1945. Committed approximately 2,200,000 Soviet soldiers, 7,000 tanks, 33,500 guns and mortars, and 5,000 aircraft across a front stretching more than 300 kilometers. The artillery preparation that opened the offensive varied in duration between 25 and 107 minutes, depending on the specific sector, and fired approximately 1,300,000 shells in a single morning. The entire Fallschirm Panzer Corps possessed, at the moment of the offensive's launch, approximately 340 tons of artillery ammunition in its supply dumps. The Soviet opening barrage consumed more explosive ordnance in its first hour than the HG Corps had available in total. This is not a comparison designed to suggest the HG was exceptionally weak. It was weak in ways consistent with the broader Wehrmacht condition in January of 1945. The comparison is designed to establish the scale at which the Corps was operating and the scale at which it was being struck. The two scales bore no relationship to each other. The Panzer IV, Ausführung H and J models that formed the core of the Corps' armored strength in January of 1945 consumed approximately 300 liters of diesel per 100 kilometers on roads, and approximately 500 liters per 100 kilometers cross-country. In the mixed terrain conditions of the Polish plain in winter, partly paved roads, partly snow-covered farmland, partly frozen streams and fields, a working average of approximately 380 liters per 100 kilometers is a reasonable operational estimate. With 6,200 liters of actual fuel available on January 15th, the Corps' approximately 40 operational Panzer IVs could collectively travel roughly 1,600 tank kilometers before running dry, an average of approximately 40 kilometers per vehicle. 40 kilometers was the distance between an organized withdrawal and an encirclement in the operational geometry of January 1945. Every day began with the same calculation. Every day the answer was different, because the allocation was different, and the operational distance requirement was different, and the answer was always smaller than what the tactical situation demanded. Between the 12th and the 31st of January, the Fallschirm Panzer Corps lost approximately 89 armored vehicles by the best available reconstruction from unit destruction certificates and Soviet capture records. Of these 89 losses, approximately 31 were combat destroyed, hit by Soviet anti-tank weapons or artillery, and rendered non-operational by enemy fire. Approximately 24 were destroyed by their own crews after mechanical failure, tanks that broke down and couldn't be repaired in the time available before Soviet forces closed in. Approximately 34 were abandoned due to fuel exhaustion, tanks that ran dry on the withdrawal roads and were left behind because there was no fuel to move them and no time to destroy them properly. More than a third of the armored losses in those 19 days were caused not by Soviet firepower, but by the absence of 48,000 liters of diesel per day. The Wehrmacht's December 1944 fuel allocation was consuming the Corps' armored strength as effectively as the Soviet 52nd Army. Moving on the same roads as the retreating military columns, in the same direction and at roughly the same speed, were the civilians of East Prussia and Western Poland. Hundreds of thousands of people who had delayed their flight west in the hope that the Soviet offensive would be stopped, and who were now discovering that the stop wasn't coming. Horse-drawn carts, farm vehicles pressed into service as family transport, people walking with what they could carry. This was the texture of the roads that HG tank crews were navigating in January of 1945. Post-war testimonies collected by German refugee organizations in the 1950s, specifically the Erlebnisberichte, filed by displaced East Prussians in the documentation program coordinated by West German authorities, include accounts of encounters with military vehicles on these roads, some of them identified by the white-collar piping of the HG. The tank crew and the refugee column were occupying the same geography simultaneously, both moving west under the same operational clock, divided by the difference between a vehicle that moved under its own power and one that moved at the pace of a horse in January cold. I keep returning to a specific detail from the refugee testimonies. Not a named account, because naming individual accounts requires individual consent that I don't have, but a type that the composite record supports. A tank stops on a road. The commander opens the hatch. He asks a woman in a civilian column where she is going. She says, "West." He says nothing and closes the hatch, and the tank moves on. The exchange is recorded because it was anomalous, a moment of human contact in a context of mechanical movement. The white collar piping on the commander's jacket is noted in the account. The record doesn't know what he was thinking. It doesn't know if he had a family in a town that the Soviet army was about to overrun, or whether the woman he spoke to was from a city that would be renamed when the new borders were drawn. The record only knows that a tank stopped, a question was asked, an answer was given, and the tank drove on. That is the texture of the January 1945 retreat that no operational record captures, and that the human record preserves in the specific detail of one stopped tank on one frozen road. The Corps attempted to establish defensive lines on successive river systems as it retreated west. The Neru, the Vistula tributary, the Oder approaches, and each position was flanked or breached within 24 to 48 hours. The pattern was not a failure of tactical skill. The pattern was the product of a strategic situation in which any position, however well chosen, could be turned by a force with 7,000 tanks and 2 million soldiers that could afford to leave some of them in front while sending others around the flanks. The HG had 40 operational tanks. The Soviet formation it was facing had hundreds in its immediate sector. The defensive positions held for the time they held because of the tactical competence that Sicily and Italy had installed in the crews and commanders. The same hull-down technique, the same terrain reading, the same night withdrawal timing that Schmaltz had practiced on the eastern road through Sicily in July of 1943. The competence was real. It was simply operating at a scale and against a force where competence alone couldn't change the outcome. By late January and into February, the Corps was in Silesia, retreating through a landscape that was simultaneously a military theater and a humanitarian catastrophe. The towns the retreat passed through were being stripped of any remaining population as German administration collapsed district by district. Soviet forces were advancing in some sectors faster than the retreat could maintain contact. Supply convoys, when they came, arrived with partial allocations that were already spoken for by the time they reached the forward units. The Fallschirm Panzer Corps War Diary, for this period, records the condition of a formation that is not yet broken, but is operating at the absolute limit of its institutional coherence, making decisions at every level of command, based on resources that are always insufficient, maintaining a fighting capacity that is always less than the situation requires, holding on through a combination of professional habit and the specific stubbornness that characterizes soldiers who haven't been formally told that it's over. They'd been told. The fuel allocation told them every day. They kept going anyway. The retreat continued through February towards Saxony and the area of Dresden and Bautzen, where the last significant engagement involving the HG Corps would take place in late April. The pencil note in the war diary, 12 hours of movement, had described the opening condition of the final phase. What followed was not a departure from that condition. It was an extension of it, repeated daily until the extension ran out of road. Chapter 13. Bautzen. A victory that lasted 11 days. April 21st to May 8th, 1945. The last engagement. The 21st of April, 1945. Berlin is in its final days. Soviet forces are fighting in the city's outer suburbs, and the Wehrmacht's organizational coherence in the capital is dissolving as the encirclement tightens. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner's Army Group Center is attempting to maintain a coherent defensive front in Saxony, and it is into this front that the Fallschirm Panzer Corps Hermann Göring, what remains of it, is committed near the Saxon town of Bautzen, population roughly 45,000, sitting at the junction of the Spree River and the main road network connecting Dresden to the east. The Corps is fighting alongside the 10th SS Panzer Division, fragments of other shattered formations, and Volkssturm units, the last-ditch German militia of men too old or too infirm for regular military service, armed primarily with the Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket, and whatever personal weapons the collapsing Wehrmacht supply system could still distribute. These Volkssturm men had been civilians in March. Some had received fewer than 4 days of military training. They were fighting beside veterans who had been in uniform since before the African campaign. The forces opposing the German positions around Bautzen were primarily the Second Polish Army under General Karol Swierczewski, advancing as part of Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front. These men require a specific identification that the last German victory framing almost never provides. They were not the soldiers of the Polish Home Army. That formation had been destroyed in the Warsaw Uprising that the HG Corps had helped to seal off the previous summer. The Second Polish Army was a Soviet-sponsored formation, created in 1944 from Polish citizens conscripted under the authority of the Lublin Committee, the Soviet-installed Polish provisional government. Many of its soldiers were Polish in language and national identity, serving under Soviet operational command, fighting for a political settlement, the post-war communist order, that most of them hadn't chosen and many privately opposed. They were conscripts in the army of a political system their country had been handed, rather than asked to approve. When the HG Corps struck them at Bautzen on the 26th and 27th of April, the Polish soldiers taking casualties were, in a precise and unromanticized sense, fighting their second war simultaneously, the physical war against German armor and the political war against the Soviet system that was using them to win territory for a Poland reshaped in Stalin's image. Polish forces entered Bautzen on approximately the 22nd to 24th of April, establishing control of the town as part of the First Ukrainian Front's advance toward Dresden. On the 26th and 27th, the HG Corps counterattacked. The German assault, combining the remaining operational armor of the Fallschirm Panzer Corps with the 10th SS Panzer Division and available Volkssturm and Hitler Youth units, struck at the boundary between the Second Polish Army and Soviet forces, in a sector where the inter-army coordination was imperfect, precisely the kind of tactical seam that experienced commanders seek in defensive situations, where attacking in strength is no longer possible. The counterattack recaptured Bautzen. The Polish Second Army suffered heavy casualties, though with Soviet reinforcements, prevented the German forces from exploiting the recapture into a broader operational success. The town remained in German hands until Germany's capitulation. 11 days. The German force at Bautzen numbered approximately 15,000 in the combined elements: HG Corps, 10th SS, Volkssturm, and attached units. The German side expended approximately 340 tons of artillery ammunition in 4 days of fighting. In the context of the Wehrmacht's weekly ammunition allocation for the Eastern Front for that week, 340 tons represented approximately 27% of the total, more than a quarter of Germany's available week's artillery shells, fired at a Saxon market town 11 days before the war ended. The strategic arithmetic of that expenditure defies conventional military analysis. The town was not a strategic objective whose possession could affect the war's outcome. It was a tactical position whose recapture served no operational purpose beyond buying a few additional days of access to westward roads for retreating German troops and civilians. 340 tons of ammunition, 11 days. That is the exchange rate of Bautzen. HG. Veterans' accounts from the battle describe the experience of fighting alongside Volkssturm men in their 50s, former factory workers, shopkeepers, farmers, who held their Panzerfaust rockets with the careful uncertainty of men handling a weapon for the second or third time. The veterans had been at this since Sicily. They'd learned their trade at Gela and on the Etna line, and in the mountains above Cassino, and on the frozen plains of East Prussia. Now they were on the flanks of men who'd been drafted into military service in the same month the Red Army crossed the Vistula. The institutional memory of the formation, the specific knowledge of how to use terrain, how to time a withdrawal, how to keep a vehicle running on improvised maintenance, was embodied in the veterans. Around them was the debris of a collapsing state, conscripting whoever remained and calling it an army. A Soviet 52nd Army after-action report from the 27th of April documents the loss of Bautzen to the German counterattack in language that is worth noting for its tone. It identifies the participating German units, including the HG Corps, describes the attack as coming at the inter-army boundary, notes the casualties sustained, and adds, with the matter-of-fact calm of a staff officer in a winning army processing a local setback, temporary setback, correction expected. The word temporary is the important one. The Soviet staff officer writing on the 27th of April, 1945, knew that whatever had happened at Bautzen that day was not going to change anything. The war was over. Germany had lost. The correction would arrive not through Soviet military action, but through German political capitulation, which was 11 days away. The last German victory was a tactical success that the victorious party noted and then filed. The Polish soldiers who died at Bautzen in the last days of April, the official Polish military history records significant casualties for the Second Army during this period, died in a battle that accomplished nothing for either side in terms of strategic outcome. For the German side, recapturing Bautzen bought roughly 11 days of road access that allowed some HG Corps units, along with substantial numbers of civilian refugees, to move west and surrender to American rather than Soviet forces, a distinction that mattered enormously to the individuals involved, given the difference in treatment that Western and Soviet captivity represented. For the Polish side, the soldiers who fell at Bautzen died in the final days of a war whose conclusion was already determined, serving an army under a political authority many of them hadn't chosen, in a battle whose outcome changed nothing about what Poland would become after the 8th of May. I find the absence of their specific accounting, their names, their origins, the towns in Poland they'd been conscripted from, in the standard treatment of Bautzen, one of the more telling silences in the popular historiography of the engagement. The HG Corps units that fought at Bautzen included men who had been with the formation since the Sicilian campaign of 1943. They had fought from the Gela Plain through the Etna Line, from Salerno through the Winter Line, from the Italian mountains to the Polish plain, and now to the Saxon town of Bautzen in the last April of the war. They had watched the Tigers of SPZA BT 504 be destroyed by naval gunfire on a Sicilian coastal road. They had field-repaired Panzer IVs in the dark during the Etna withdrawal. They had held 3 company sections of the Winter Line at night and watched the German army contract around them through 2 years of retreat. At Bautzen, they fought with skill and tactical coherence that was, by any objective measure, impressive given the state of the forces available. The recapture of the town was a genuine military achievement in the narrow operational sense. What the operational achievement cannot be permitted to do, what the structure of this series has been built to prevent, is to stand as the conclusion of this formation's story, as if the last thing that can be said about the Hermann Göring division is that it won its final battle. It didn't win a final battle. It won a tactical engagement 11 days before unconditional surrender, alongside Volkssturm men who'd been civilians in March, in a war that had produced Civitella and the Armadio della Vergogna and 340 open files in a Munich archive. Bautzen is a fact. It is not the last fact. Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. At some point in the hours around that surrender, the Fallschirm Panzer Corps Hermann Göring, or what remained of it after 6 weeks of the Eastern Front's final collapse, laid down its weapons near Dresden and became, in the administrative language of the Soviet army processing it, a body of prisoners. The cuff titles were still on the sleeves. The white collar piping was still on the collars. The formation that had been born from a typed police order on a February morning in 1933, that had carried its patron's name through 12 years and 9 countries and 6 designations, ended on the same piece of European ground where, 400 years earlier, the 30 Years' War had exhausted a continent. The pencil note in the war diary had said 12 hours of movement. It turned out to be a longer journey than 12 hours, measured from Kreuzberg to Dresden. Not longer enough. Chapter 14, The Last Arrow. Bautzen, April 1945. The smell of pine resin and wet soil was everywhere in Saxony that April. The forests east of Bautzen, the Muskauer Forst, the birch stands around Punschwitz-Kuckau, the low ridgelines that run north toward Niesky, were just beginning to show the first green of spring when the Fallschirm Panzer Corps Hermann Göring received its orders to attack. It was the 3rd week of April 1945, and Berlin was already burning 40 kilometers to the north. The men who would execute this counterattack drove Panthers and Panzer IVs that ran on synthetic fuel derived from hydrogenated coal, a fuel that robbed their engines of roughly 10% of their design power and left a distinctive pale blue exhaust trail visible at 200 meters in cold morning air. The division's cuff title, white embroidery on a dark band, stitched below the rank insignia on the left sleeve, marked every man in that formation as belonging to something singular. That singularity, built across 12 years from a Berlin police barracks to a core-strength armored force, was about to be expended on a battle that could not alter the war's outcome by a single hour. Nobody along that front line could have been wholly blind to that arithmetic, yet the orders went out, the tank engines turned over, and the attack began. The Polish Second Army that the Hermann Göring Corps struck on 21st April 1945 was a very specific kind of adversary. It was not the pre-war Polish army, nor the London exiled Home Army that the division had faced from across the Vistula the previous summer. These were soldiers of the Soviet-sponsored People's Army, raised in 1944 from Polish territory liberated by the Red Army's westward advance, officered partly by Soviet officers of Polish descent and partly by Polish communists who had spent the war years in the USSR. General Karol Swierczewski commanded approximately 80,000 to 90,000 men, 5 infantry divisions, and 500 tanks. The figure of 500 tanks deserves a moment's attention. The Polish armored strength at Bautzen was numerically superior to everything the Hermann Göring Corps and the accompanying 20th Panzer Division could put in the field. The Germans brought roughly 300 tanks and 600 artillery pieces, but many of those vehicles ran on fuel allocations described in surviving quartermaster records as inadequate for sustained operations. What the Germans possessed in experience, the Poles lacked in cohesion. Swierczewski's infantry divisions contained large numbers of conscripts drawn from newly liberated Western Polish territories who had received weeks, not months, of training. One 1944 Polish Army estimate, preserved in post-war Polish military histories, calculated that the force had 1 trained officer for every 1,200 soldiers. That ratio is not an army in the conventional sense. It is a mobilized population wearing uniforms. Swierczewski made a fatal command decision in the days before the German blow landed. He prioritized the push toward Dresden over securing the 30-kilometer southern flank of his advance, a deviation from the plan Marshal Ivan Konev had given him. By the morning of the 21st, a gap had opened between the Polish 8th and 9th Infantry Divisions, driving toward Dresden, and the 1st Armored Corps and the 5th Infantry Division, which were still crossing the Spree bridgeheads north of Bautzen. The German Görlitz Group, assembled in the Görlitz-Reichenbach region without being detected by either Polish or Soviet reconnaissance, drove precisely into that gap. The Hermann Göring formation struck the northern part of the breach, while the 20th Panzer Division swung toward Bautzen town from the west. The German exploitation was rapid, and within 24 hours, the Polish Second Army had lost cohesion, splitting into 4 isolated groups, each communicating imperfectly with the others, and with Swierczewski's headquarters. Marshal Konev sent his own chief of staff, General Ivan Petrov, forward to assess the situation, and what Petrov found was a command in crisis. Swierczewski was briefly relieved of command, though Soviet patronage quickly restored him, and the episode was suppressed in Polish communist historiography for the next 4 decades. The most lethal event of the battle's first phase was the destruction of the Polish 16th Tank Brigade and the headquarters of the 5th Infantry Division at Forskin. The 16th Tank Brigade had been moving in transit between the 2 Polish groups when the Hermann Göring Panzers swept through the Muskauer Forst and struck its column from the flank and rear. Out of approximately 1,300 men and women in that formation, about 100 survived to reach friendly lines. The divisional headquarters of the 5th Infantry Division, defended only by sapper and training battalions, men who had received engineer instruction rather than infantry combat preparation, was overrun in detail. The 5th Division's commander, General Alexander Waskiewicz, was killed. His death removed one of the more experienced leaders in the Second Army at the moment his experience was most needed. Further east, the 17th Infantry Division and the Brandenburg Division drove toward Weissenberg and encircled the Soviet 294th Rifle Division, which had been covering the Polish eastern flank. In its subsequent breakout attempt on the 24th, large parts of the 294th were destroyed. The scale of these destructions, a tank brigade reduced from 1,300 to 100, a rifle division broken in a breakout, indicates that the German attack achieved genuine tactical surprise, even against a numerically superior enemy in the war's final weeks. The house-to-house fighting for Bautzen town itself lasted several days and was conducted at the level of individual buildings and cellar walls. German forces inside the town's perimeter, remnants of garrison units, supply troops, and Volkssturm companies, held out long enough for the 20th Panzer Division to break through from the south and establish contact on the 24th. Major General Hermann von Oppeln-Bronichowski commanded the junction operation and immediately ordered a combined assault into the town from its southern approaches, coordinating with the trapped garrison to strike the Polish defenders from two directions simultaneously. The Polish counterattack to prevent the link-up failed. By the 25th, most of Bautzen was in German hands, and Hitler, following the battle's progress from the Führer bunker in Berlin, sent a personal congratulatory message to Field Marshal Schörner. Schörner's role here warrants note. He was a commanding general whose orders to hold ground under penalty of summary execution had already by this point been responsible for the deaths of dozens of his own officers for retreat without authorization. The victory at Bautzen was achieved under a command culture that treated withdrawal as treason. Outside the town, the German advance ran short of fuel. This is a fact that appears in multiple German and Polish post-war accounts, and that illustrates better than any tactical summary the material reality of the war's final month. The Fallschirm Panzer Corps, Hermann Göring, was, by October 1944 standards, a formidable armored formation. Its Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, Hans Sandrock's unit alone, claimed 123 enemy tanks and armored vehicles destroyed during the East Prussia fighting, and its Panther companies had demonstrated during the battles around Gumbinnen in October 1944 that the Corps could fight with devastating competence. Oberleutnant Gerhard Tschirschwitz's 2nd Panther Company had conducted a deep penetration raid in October, destroying 16 tanks, 16 anti-tank guns, 6 artillery pieces, and 13 machine guns in a single roaming operation behind Soviet lines, collecting German stragglers and withdrawing intact. Feldwebel Fritz Bowitz had destroyed 13 Soviet tanks in a single day. These were men who knew their trade thoroughly. By April 1945, the same men, in the same tanks, simply could not obtain enough fuel to exploit a tactical success into something operationally meaningful. They stopped at the Schwarzer Schops River, not because Soviet resistance defeated them, but because the fuel in their tanks ran dry, and resupply could not reach them. The Polish 9th Infantry Division's destruction on the 26th was the battle's most terrible single episode. Ordered to retreat from its isolated position near Dresden and rejoin the main Polish forces, the 9th moved without adequate reconnaissance and without sufficient security on its flanks, an error compounded by the fact that German forces had captured Polish orders detailing the planned withdrawal routes. The 26th Infantry Regiment of the 9th Division was intercepted in the narrow valley approaches around Panschwitz-Kuckau and Krostwitz and suffered casualties of 75%. A Polish military hospital convoy from the same division was ambushed near Horka. Most of its personnel and wounded were executed. There was one survivor, the division's chaplain, Father Jan Rydzanek. The division commander, Colonel Alexander Lasky, was captured. What had been a fighting formation of several thousand men ceased to exist as an effective force, its remaining survivors absorbed into the Soviet 19th Guards Rifle Division. Polish historian Zbigniew Wauer, writing in 2010 for Polska Zbrojna, called Bautzen the bloodiest battle the Polish army had fought since the Battle of Bzura in September 1939. Polish official estimates recorded 4,902 killed, 10,532 wounded, and 2,798 missing, a total of approximately 18,000 casualties, along with 200 tanks destroyed, representing 57% of the Second Army's armored strength. Some Polish estimates place the total higher, at 25,000. From the researcher's perspective, Bautzen presents a specific historiographical problem. For 4 decades, the battle was politically unusable. In the Polish People's Republic, the near destruction of a Soviet-sponsored army at the hands of the Wehrmacht, 18 days before Germany's surrender, could not be acknowledged as a defeat. Official accounts described it as a difficult but victorious engagement. Zwierczewski, who had been briefly relieved of command by Marshal Konev for incompetence. Some Polish sources, including Henryk Piecook's 1997 study of the Secret Services, suggest he was commanding the battle while drunk, was posthumously elevated to heroic status in Communist Poland after his assassination in 1947. The Hermann Göring Corps, meanwhile, absorbed the tactical success into a veteran's narrative that emphasized operational skill and discipline, making no mention of what those same veterans had done in the Apennine valleys of Tuscany the previous summer. Both official narratives served political needs. Neither told the truth. There's a detail that stays with you when you read through the German order of battle documents for Bautzen, alongside the casualty returns. The Sturm Battalion of the Fallschirm Panzer Corps, Hermann Göring, had entered the East Prussia fighting in September 1944, with a strength of 974 men. Between the 10th of September and the 31st of December 1944, before Bautzen, it had lost 11 officers, 107 NCOs, and 488 enlisted men, including its commander. The formation that fought at Bautzen in April was something less than the one that had fought at Gumbinnen in October. The veterans of Sicily, of Salerno, of the Anzio counterattack, of the Gothic Line, the men who had learned their trade across 2 years of the war's most demanding fighting, were mostly dead or captured. What fought at Bautzen was partly those veterans and partly teenagers equipped with Panzerfauste and bolt-action rifles captured from other fronts. The records note one such teenager, Gefreiter Albert Plapper, 18 years old, 4th Company, Fallschirm Panzergrenadier Regiment, 2HG, who stopped a Soviet infantry attack with a captured Russian machine gun and then destroyed 5 T-34 tanks with a Panzerschreck before leading a counterattack to stabilize the German line. He was awarded the Knight's Cross. His age is the fact that doesn't leave you. By the 30th of April, the Polish Second Army and Soviet reinforcements had stabilized their line along the Kamenz to Doberschutz to Dauben axis. The Hermann Göring Corps held Bautzen and its surrounding villages. Berlin fell on the 2nd of May. The war in Europe ended officially on the 8th of May 1945. The question that Bautzen leaves open, the one that carries forward into everything that follows, is not whether the German attack was tactically competent. It was. The question is what tactical competence, deployed in April 1945, means when weighed against everything else the division had done. The town of Bautzen, today a quiet cultural center in Saxony, with Sorbian-language street signs and a medieval cathedral visible from the main square, held a memorial to the Polish and Soviet soldiers killed in its vicinity. For decades, that memorial was the only public acknowledgement that the battle had taken place at all. The archive that could have explained exactly which Hermann Göring units were in which positions during the town fighting had, already, by the time researchers arrived to look for it, been scattered across 3 countries. Chapter 15. What Remains: Surrender, Captivity, and the Broken Archive. The 8th of May 1945 arrived in Saxony as a gray morning with low cloud and intermittent drizzle. The Fallschirm Panzer Corps Hermann Göring had been fighting almost continuously for the preceding 3 weeks, moving westward through the wreckage of the Central German front after the Bautzen engagement ended, attempting to surrender to American rather than Soviet forces. This was a preference shared by virtually every German unit on the Eastern Front in those final days, and it stemmed from a calculation that was both rational and, in the case of a division with the Hermann Göring's operational record, acutely self-interested. The 1st Fallschirm Panzer Division, Hermann Göring, formally surrendered near Dresden, placing it within the Soviet zone of occupation. Its men became Soviet prisoners of war. The division's cuff title, that white embroidered sleeve band that had been stitched onto uniforms since the late 1930s, identifying every wearer, served an identification function in NKVD processing that the men wearing it could not have welcomed. Soviet screening teams knew exactly which formation bore that name. They had been fighting it since July 1944, at the Vistula bridgeheads, at Radziemen, at Gumbinnen, at Königsberg approaches, and finally at Bautzen. The paperwork was already waiting. Soviet NKVD prisoner of war processing in May 1945 was not a casual administrative exercise. Each prisoner passed through a multi-stage screening that recorded unit designation, length of service, theaters of operation, and, critically, any participation in anti-partisan or security operations. For a division that had conducted documented anti-partisan reprisal killings in Tuscany and the northern Apennines in 1944, the answer to that question was not one that would accelerate a man's release date. The screening questionnaires were detailed enough that a soldier who had served exclusively in frontline combat roles could be distinguished, at least on paper, from one whose service record showed assignment to units that had conducted reprisals. In practice, the distinction was applied inconsistently, and a man's fate often depended more on the particular NKVD officer conducting the screening, the clarity of his German, and the completeness of whatever Wehrmacht paybook he carried, than on the objective content of his service record. The average return date for German prisoners of war who had surrendered to Soviet forces, was approximately 1950 for enlisted men. For officers, returns continued until 1953, and in some cases beyond. For men of formations flagged during NKVD screening as having participated in anti-partisan operations, detention was routinely extended. What this means, translated into human terms, is that a 20-year-old grenadier who had been conscripted into the Corps in late 1944 and had never set foot in Italy might spend 5 years in a Soviet labor camp because his paybook bore the name Hermann Göring. The German Red Cross tracing service, the Suchdienst, operates from Munich and maintains the most comprehensive records of German military personnel fates during and after the Second World War. In the years following 1945, families who did not know what had happened to fathers, sons, and brothers submitted inquiries that generated files, each containing whatever documentation existed: a Wehrmacht identification photograph, a last known unit, a last known address, a date of last contact. The Suchdienst files for Hermann Göring Division personnel that remained unresolved, meaning no confirmed death, no confirmed release from captivity, no confirmed post-war contact, numbered in the hundreds. Some of those men had been killed in the war's final weeks and buried in unmarked graves across Saxony and Silesia. Some had died in Soviet captivity before any repatriation agreement took effect. Some had been processed under variant name spellings and were recorded in Soviet archives under entries that no matching German record had yet been connected to. The work of reconciling those files is ongoing, conducted by a German-Russian archival cooperation project that was already being complicated before the research for this documentary was completed by reduced Russian willingness to open NKVD camp records to external researchers. 340 files in the Suchdienst system related to Hermann Göring Division personnel remained open as of the most recent publicly available data. Each of those 340 files represents a person who cannot yet be given a definitive end to their story. The number 340 is not large, measured against the tens of thousands who served in the division across its 12-year existence. But 340 families who never received a confirmed answer, who received instead the word missing, stamped on a form and then nothing further, is a specific and persistent human cost of the archive's incompleteness. When historians write about the war's bureaucratic aftermath, they tend to focus on the trials, the denazification proceedings, the reparations negotiations. The open Suchdienst files are a quieter form of the same unfinished business. Not political, not legal, just the specific weight of unanswered questions borne by specific families across specific decades. Hermann Göring himself, the patron whose name the division wore, surrendered not to Soviet forces, but to the United States Army's 36th Infantry Division in Bavaria on the 9th of May 1945. He arrived, by multiple accounts, in immaculate uniform, accompanied by his luggage, his personal train car, and apparently a firm expectation of being treated as a head of state rather than a war criminal. The Americans obliged him, initially. He was housed, fed, and interviewed extensively before being transferred to the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. His testimony there, in the spring of 1946, addressed the division that bore his name in a single formula that his defense attorneys had helped him rehearse. Ich habe dem Verband meinen Namen gegeben. Für seine Handlungen in Einzelheiten konnte ich nicht verantwortlich sein. I gave the formation my name. For its actions in detail, I could not be held responsible. It is a sentence that is technically accurate and substantively evasive in equal measure. Göring had given the formation political sponsorship, preferential equipment allocations, direct access to his personal attention. He visited the Corps at its headquarters at Gut Ostenshof, near Nemmersdorf in October 1944, posing for photographs with General Schmaltz, hunting on the Roman Tay Heath one final time before the lodge was burned to prevent its capture. He knew the formation existed. He cared about its reputation, and he used its combat record to bolster his own standing within the Nazi hierarchy. The claim that he bore no responsibility for its actions in detail is the oldest defense available to anyone who has ever commanded anything. The Nuremberg Tribunal's final judgment, delivered in October 1946, included a passage that the division's veterans would spend the next 4 decades trying to suppress. The tribunal recorded that evidence has been found to show that a large number of the atrocities in Italy was committed by the Hermann Göring Parachute Panzer Division, notable offenders in this connection, and then the text continued with specific individuals. The phrase, notable offenders, is tribunal language for a specific category of documented perpetrator. It is not an allegation or a probability. It is a finding, made by an international judicial body, based on documentary evidence collected by British intelligence officers who had interviewed survivors, collected depositions, and produced the report stamped secret that eventually ended up in the wooden cabinet, the Armadio della Vergogna, in Rome. General Wilhelm Schmalz, the division's final commander, was tried by an Italian military court and acquitted on the 12th of July 1950. The acquittal did not mean the tribunal found the allegations unfounded. It meant that in 1950, given the political pressures of the early Cold War, given the Italian government's interest in rebuilding its relationship with West Germany, and given the unavailability of key documentary evidence that was still faced to the wall in a cabinet in Rome, a prosecution could not be sustained to the required standard of proof. Schmalz lived until the 14th of March, 1983. He was 71 years old when he was tried, and 81 when he died. The structural problem with the post-war accountability record for the Hermann Göring division is not simply that perpetrators escaped justice, though some did. It's that the evidentiary record was systematically incomplete from the beginning. The United States Army Historical Division produced its post-war manuscript series, housed at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 338, through a questionnaire process that asked German officers about tactical decisions, logistical problems, and operational planning. It did not ask about civilian targeting. It was not designed to ask about civilian targeting. Its purpose was to extract operational intelligence useful to a military planning for the Cold War, not to construct a legal record of atrocities. The result is a body of documentation, hundreds of pages of after-action analysis, order of battle reconstructions, tactical assessments, that describes the Hermann Göring division as a competent, occasionally brilliant armored formation, and says almost nothing about what it did in the villages between Arezzo and Florence in the summer of 1944. That silence is not an oversight. It is an archive shaped by the questions that were asked of it. From the researcher's standpoint, the post-war manuscript series is indispensable and dangerous in equal measure. It contains information about unit strengths, equipment states, fuel consumption rates, and tactical doctrine that exists nowhere else in such concentrated form. When this documentary series describes the Gela counterattack, or the Salerno crisis, or the East Prussian fighting, it does so with precision and detail that illuminate the division's operational history in ways that no other source can match. But when you cross-reference those manuscripts with Carlo Gentile's 2012 German-language study, Wehrmacht und Waffen-SS im Partisanenkrieg, Italien 1943 bis 1945, or with the NS-Täteritalien.org project's case-by-case documentation of massacre sites, a division emerges that is simultaneously two things: a tactically coherent armored formation, and a unit responsible for the killing of at least 2,500 Italian civilians. Both things are documented. Both things are true. The manuscripts describe the first. They do not describe the second. Any history of the Hermann Göring division that relies primarily on the manuscript series will, by the logic of its sources, describe only half the formation. There is a detail about the archival gap that feels, when you encounter it, like the quietest indictment available. The Armadio della Vergogna, the wooden cabinet discovered in 1994 by Italian military prosecutor Antonino Intellisano in a storage room at Palazzo Chesi Gatti in Rome, contains 695 files documenting war crimes perpetrated on Italian soil. The cabinet had apparently been placed face to the wall in an unused room in the immediate post-war period and had remained there for nearly 50 years. The archive it contained had been compiled by British Secret Intelligence Service officers who had collected survivor depositions, matched them with unit identifications, and produced a document stamped secret and handed to Italian magistrates, who had then done nothing with it. The reasons why remain, as the Wikipedia entry on the Palazzo Chesi Gatti archive carefully notes, unclear to this day. The files led, after 1994, to judicial proceedings reopening investigations into the Sant'Anna di Stazzema massacre, the Marzabotto massacre, the Ardeatine Caves massacre, and numerous others. The Hermann Göring Division's specific actions in the Arezzo province figured in this record. Italy released the full archive publicly in February 2016, 22 years after its discovery, 71 years after the events it documented. 3 former soldiers of units that had operated in concert with the Hermann Göring Division were sentenced to life imprisonment by a military appeals court in Rome in October 2012. The final accounting of the division's men, the living ones, was neither clean nor complete. By 1950, most enlisted men had been repatriated from Soviet captivity. Officers took longer. The last Soviet-held German prisoners did not return until 1956. Of those who returned, some passed through denazification proceedings. Many did not, because the West German denazification process, underfunded, politically pressured, and chronologically compressed, could not manage the caseload its own laws theoretically required. Those who had served in command positions during the Italian anti-partisan operations, and who were known to Italian or German investigators, entered a limbo of open files, incomplete prosecutions, and eventual administrative closure. The 340 Suchdienst files that remain open today represent men who passed through none of these processes, whose fates could not be determined, who exist only as a Wehrmacht photograph and a last known address in some town that may now be in Poland, or the Czech Republic, or Russia. History accumulates rather than concludes. The archive doesn't close, it just acquires more dust. Chapter 16, the Veterans Version, Myth-Making in the Bundesrepublik. The Kameradschaft, the Veterans Association of the former Hermann Göring Division, held its first post-war reunion in West Germany in the early 1950s. By that point, the Federal Republic of Germany had formally rearmed. The Adenauer government was integrating former Wehrmacht officers into the new Bundeswehr, and the general atmosphere of the early Cold War encouraged a view of former German soldiers as useful anti-communist assets rather than subjects of ongoing moral interrogation. The Veterans Newsletter, produced through the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1990s, described the division in terms its members found comfortable and accurate. A formation that had fought well, maintained discipline, respected the laws of war, and served Germany in the most difficult conditions imaginable. The Civitella massacre of June 1944, in which soldiers of the Vesuv Alarm Company of the Hermann Göring Division attacked the village of Civitella in Val di Chiana at dawn and killed every man they could find, as part of a reprisal wave that claimed 744 civilian lives across the Arezzo province, appeared nowhere in those newsletters. The word Vesuv appeared nowhere. The 744 dead appeared nowhere. The narrative in the newsletter was internally consistent precisely because it was curated with care. Understanding how veterans' narratives function requires understanding the specific social pressures that shape them. The men who returned from Soviet captivity in the late 1940s and early 1950s returned to a West Germany in which speaking openly about atrocities was both legally dangerous, denazification proceedings were still nominally active, and socially destructive. A man who admitted participation in reprisal killings could not build a career, maintain family relationships, or reintegrate into civilian life in the way that a man who described himself as a soldier who had done his duty could. The incentive structure was entirely aligned towards silence and self-exculpatory narrative. The Kameradschaft newsletter was not a forum for truth-telling, it was a forum for community maintenance. And community maintenance required a shared story that all its members could inhabit without contradiction. The story it chose was the story of the good soldier, technically proficient, politically obedient, but personally decent, victimized ultimately by a leadership he had not chosen and a war he had not started. That narrative is partially true. It is not wholly true. The parts it omits are the parts that cost 744 Italian civilians their lives. The American Historical Manuscript Series, Record Group 338 at the National Archives, provided the veterans' narrative with an unexpected institutional ally. Because the American questionnaires had not asked about civilian targeting, and because the resulting manuscripts focused exclusively on tactical and operational questions, American military historians, who used those manuscripts as their primary sources, produced histories of the Hermann Göring Division that described it in precisely the terms the veterans themselves preferred, as a combat formation, assessed by combat metrics. The 1953 Osprey series precursor publications, the the various unit histories produced through the 1960s and 1970s by American military historians working on the Mediterranean campaign, all drew heavily on German manuscripts that had been produced by cooperative former officers, men with every reason to describe their unit's performance in professionally admirable terms. This created a feedback loop. The American manuscripts validated the veterans' narrative. The veterans' narrative shaped what former officers wrote in the manuscripts, and historians who trusted the manuscripts reproduced the veterans' narrative as history. The loop was not a conspiracy. It was the natural consequence of an archive built from partial questions. The first serious challenge to that feedback loop came from Italian and German academic historians working in the 1990s and 2000s with sources that the manuscript series had never accessed. Carlo Gentile's 1998 report, commissioned by the municipalities of Bucine, Cavriglia, Civitella in Val di Chiana, and Stia, in preparation for judicial proceedings against the division's crimes, drew on captured German operational documents held in Italian archives, Italian judicial records, survivor depositions collected in the immediate post-war period, and British intelligence files. Gentile's 2012 monograph, Wehrmacht und Waffen-SS im Partisanenkrieg, Italian, 1943 to 1945, synthesized this research into the most comprehensive existing account of German anti-partisan operations in Italy, identifying the Hermann Göring Division as one of the two principal perpetrators of the escalation of violence against Italian civilians, the other being the 16th Panzer Grenadier Division, Reichsführer SS. The figure that Gentile's research produced, at least 2,500 Italian civilians killed by the division, was not the figure that appeared in the veterans' newsletter. It was not the figure that appeared in any American manuscript-based history of the division. It was the figure that emerged when you asked different questions of different sources. The Civitella massacre deserves its own specific accounting, because the detail of how it was conducted tells you something the aggregate number cannot. On the 29th of June 1944, soldiers of the Hermann Göring Division's Vesuve Alarm Company, an ad hoc reprisal unit, entered the village of Civitella in Val di Chiana in the Arezzo province of Tuscany before dawn. They went door to door and killed all the men they could find. The pretext was a partisan attack some days earlier, in which German soldiers had been killed. The logic was the standard reprisal logic that Wehrmacht and SS formations applied across occupied Europe, but which the Hermann Göring Division applied in the Italian theater with a frequency and a casualty ratio that exceeded even the official Wehrmacht reprisal guidance of 50 to 100 Italian civilians for every German soldier killed. The women and children of Civitella were not killed. They were left to live with what had been done. Survivors interviewed decades later described returning to find their fathers, husbands, and brothers lying in the streets and in the doorways of their houses. The village lost the majority of its adult male population in a single morning. Today, a memorial archive in Civitella preserves the survivor testimonies alongside the photographs of the dead. The archive is careful, specific, and unambiguous about which formation carried out the killing. The veterans community's response to the emergence of this scholarship was not uniform. Some former members of the division, confronted in the 1990s and 2000s with documentation they could not dismiss, acknowledged that atrocities had occurred while distancing themselves personally from participation. A response that is both humanly understandable and historically slippery, since it preserves individual innocence while conceding collective guilt in a way that forecloses legal accountability for any specific person. Others maintained categorical denial, arguing that the documented killings had been carried out by other units, or that the partisan provocations had been severe enough to justify the response, or that the accounts were exaggerated. The denial position became increasingly difficult to maintain after the 2000s, when Italian military courts, reopened partly through the impetus of the Armadio della Vergogna discovery, produced verdicts that relied on documentation too specific to dismiss. Individual names, unit assignments, specific orders, specific locations, specific dates. In 2012, 3 former soldiers of formations that had operated alongside the Hermann Göring Division in the Arezzo area were sentenced to life imprisonment by an Italian military appeals court. The sentences were handed down to men who were in their 80s and 90s. The legal process had taken 68 years. The role of the Nuremberg Tribunal's finding in this long legal history is worth examining carefully. The tribunal's statement that a large number of the atrocities in Italy was committed by the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, and that there were notable offenders, was made in 1946 and was based on British SIS intelligence files. That finding was a legal determination by an international tribunal, not a historical allegation. It established, to the tribunal's standard of proof, that the division as a formation bore institutional responsibility for atrocities in Italy. It did not result in prosecutions of individual division members at Nuremberg, because the tribunal was focused on the major war criminals, the 22 defendants at the dock, rather than on divisional-level accountability. The finding went into the tribunal's record. It went into the Armadio della Vergogna. It sat, face to the wall, for 50 years. When it re-emerged in 1994, the men who might have been prosecuted on its basis in 1946 were either dead, elderly, or beyond the reach of any realistic justice process. Accountability is a function of time as much as of evidence, and the time had been used up. From the researcher's perspective, the veteran's narrative is a document in its own right, not a reliable account of what happened, but a reliable account of what a community of men needed to believe about what happened in order to function. The newsletter that described the division's honor code and cited only German sources for its claim of lawful conduct was produced by men who had, in many cases, served honorably in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, and had then, in some cases, participated in or witnessed acts that no code of honor could accommodate. Both things happened to the same people, in some instances on the same day. The historical record that this documentary series has tried to build is not an argument that every man who served in the Hermann Göring division was a war criminal. It is an argument that the division as an institution committed war crimes, documented, judicially affirmed, specifically located war crimes, and that the veteran's narrative, by omitting those crimes, produced a false history that shaped how the division was understood for 50 years. The militaria market provides a blunt epilogue to the veteran's mythology. The Hermann Göring Division's cuff title, the white embroidered sleeve band, appears regularly at German militaria auctions. A documented original example sold in Germany in 2024 for €1,850. The purchaser's motivations are not recorded in the auction catalog. What is recorded is the price, which encodes a specific cultural valuation. This object is worth approximately the same as a month's average German rent, because it carries the compressed weight of a history that combines operational prestige with everything that operational prestige was used to obscure. The fact that such objects are auctioned legally, rather than being treated as the material evidence of a criminal organization, reflects the specific legal status of the Hermann Göring Division. Unlike the SS, it was not declared a criminal organization by the Nuremberg Tribunal. Its Luftwaffe identity, that anomaly that had defined it since 1935, that made it neither Wehrmacht nor SS, but something between, had one last benefit to bestow. In death as in life, the name offered a kind of cover. There is a survivor account that does not come from within the division. It comes from Civitella, an elderly woman, interviewed in the early 2000s by researchers working on the NS-TAETER-ITALIEN.org project, described the morning of the 29th of June, 1944. She described the soldiers coming before dawn, the sounds from the street, the silence that followed. She was precise about what she saw, and was careful about what she did not see. She said, "Li abbiamo aspettati per anni, per una spiegazione. Non è mai arrivata." We waited for them for years, for an explanation. It never came. What she was waiting for was not, by the time those words were recorded, ever going to arrive from the men who had been there. The question that carries forward from this chapter into the next is whether an explanation that arrives through scholarship and archives is the same thing as the explanation she was asking for, or whether those are two different things that we have been treating as one. Chapter 17, The Quiet Exit, What the Archive Leaves Behind. The German-Russian archival cooperation project that attempts to match Suchdienst open files with Soviet NKVD camp records operates through an organization called the Deutsch-Russische Gesellschaft zur Förderung der Erinnerungskultur, and its work proceeds at the pace of bureaucratic patience rather than scholarly urgency. The project's researchers photograph Soviet-era card index entries, each entry a small rectangle of cardboard on which a camp administrator wrote a prisoner's name, date of birth, unit, date of arrival, and, if applicable, date and cause of death, and attempt to cross-reference them with the Wehrmacht paybook data held in the Suchdienst files. The challenge is partly orthographic. German names transliterated into Russian Cyrillic and back into Latin script acquire variations that a database without fuzzy matching algorithms cannot easily reconcile. A soldier named Bruckner might appear in a Soviet camp record as Bruckner or Brickner, depending on which NKVD clerk processed him and which transliteration convention they applied. The Suchdienst file lists him as Bruckner, and the cross-reference fails. He remains technically unresolved. Multiply this by 340 files. Add the reality that Russian archive access for this kind of research has narrowed significantly since 2022, and the prospect of closing all the open files becomes a function of political weather rather than scholarly capability. The historiographical landscape for the Hermann Göring Division in 2026 is more complete than it has ever been, and it is still incomplete in ways that matter. Lawrence Patterson's 2021 study, Fallschirm Panzer Division, Hermann Göring, A History of the Luftwaffe's Only Armored Division, 1933 to 1945, published by Pen and Sword, provides the most comprehensive English-language operational history of the formation, drawing on German military records, post-war manuscripts, and secondary literature to produce a narrative that tracks the division from its 1933 police origins through to the 1945 surrender. It is an operational history in the tradition of English-language unit histories, and it assesses the division primarily as a fighting formation. Carlo Gentile's body of work, conducted in German and Italian from a base at the University of Cologne, provides the complementary account. The division as a perpetrator of mass civilian violence in Italy. Gordon Williamson and Stephen Andrews' Osprey publication, The Hermann Göring Division, 2003, provides accessible order of battle and insignia data that serves researchers of material culture. These three bodies of work do not contradict each other. They describe different aspects of the same formation. A complete account requires all three, and the fact that they are written in three languages, published by publishers targeting three different audiences, and cited by three largely non-overlapping scholarly communities, means that the complete account has never yet been written as a single coherent text. The Osprey Men-at-Arms volume, the small format reference guide that a collector or wargamer might pick up for its color plates and badge illustrations, is worth thinking about as an artifact of historical representation. It describes the division's insignia, its commanders, its order of battle, and its operational deployments with accuracy and detail. It contains color illustrations of the uniform items that now appear at auction. It does not contain a color illustration of Civitella. There is no illustration captioned Vesuve Alarm Company Reprisal Kit, June 1944. The absence is not surprising. The book is a reference guide to military organization, not a moral history. But the absence is real, and the book's audience receives a representation of the division that is complete in its technical details and silent on its human costs. The Men-at-Arms volume will sell far more copies in its lifetime than Gentile's monograph. The audience for accessible military reference guides vastly exceeds the audience for academic German-language studies of anti-partisan violence. This is not a complaint about Osprey publishing. It is an observation about how historical knowledge distributes itself through a market, and what that distribution produces in the aggregate. The question of what the division was, institutionally, categorically, in the accounting of history, remains genuinely open in ways that go beyond academic debate. The Nuremberg Tribunal classified it as a notable offender in Italy, but did not declare it a criminal organization in the way the SS was declared. Its Luftwaffe identity, which had been an administrative anomaly throughout the war, became in the post-war legal landscape a material advantage. The legal framework constructed at Nuremberg to deal with criminal organizations was designed with the SS in mind, and the Hermann Göring Division fell between its categories. It was too army-like to be treated as SS, too Luftwaffe-identified to be treated as a standard Wehrmacht division, subject to the Wehrmacht's own post-war scrutiny, and too politically connected, to a man who was already dead by suicide before sentencing, to have a clear institutional owner who could be held responsible. The formation that had never quite belonged to any single branch of the German armed forces was, in death, too ambiguous for any single legal framework to fully grasp. The Italy in which the Civitella massacre occurred has changed fundamentally in the 80 years since June 1944. The Arezzo province is wine country now. Chianti Classico vineyards, agriturismo estates, the kind of landscape that appears in travel photography as an emblem of peaceful pastoral beauty. The village of Civitella in Val di Chiana has a population of a few thousand people, a medieval church, and a memorial archive. The archive contains photographs of the victims, their names, their ages, their occupations. The youngest male victim recorded in the available documentation was a boy. The oldest was an old man. The documentation specifies that the WW2 alarm company attacked at dawn, going systematically through the village. The word systematically appears in survivor testimony after survivor testimony, collected by researchers in the 2000s from women who had been children or young adults in 1944. Systematically is the word they use for a thing that had a planned character, that did not feel random, that felt instead like the execution of a decision made somewhere else by someone with authority. From the soldier's end of an order, systematic violence is a technical problem. How many men, what sector, what time, what disposition of bodies afterward. From the village's end, it is the end of the world as it existed until that morning. The researchers who worked on the German-Italian Historical Commission, established in the early 2000s to document the full scope of German crimes in Italy, encountered a specific archival problem that the Armadio della Vergogna had exemplified. The documents existed, but they had been distributed across institutions in ways that made a comprehensive picture difficult to assemble. British SIS files in London, Italian judicial records in Rome, German military records in Freiburg's Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, American manuscript series in College Park, Maryland, Soviet NKVD camp records in Moscow. Each archive held a piece of the picture. No archive held the whole picture. The Commission's final report, presented to the Italian and German governments, documented over 3,000 German and Italian mass civilian deaths during the occupation, distributed across hundreds of incidents. The Hermann Göring Division's share of that total was documented as at least 2,500 killed. The report noted that accountability proceedings had been incomplete and in most cases had not resulted in sentences. The German government received the report, acknowledged it, and expressed regret. The Italian government received it similarly. The families who had been waiting for an explanation had received, by that point, a scholarly accounting, which is a different thing. From the researcher's perspective, the final chapters of the Hermann Göring Division's history resist the narrative closure that documentary format tends to demand. There is no single moment at which justice was served, no trial that produced sentences proportionate to the documented deaths, no official ceremony at which the surviving veterans acknowledged what their formation had done and what that meant for the people it was done to. What exists instead is an accumulation. The Nuremberg Tribunal's 1946 finding, sitting in a courtroom record. The Armadio della Vergogna, faced to the wall for 50 years. Carlo Gentile's research, published in a language most of the division's veterans could not read. The Italian court sentences of 2012, handed to octogenarians, the 340 open Suchdienst files, the auction catalogs. The accumulation is not resolution. It is the ongoing sedimentation of a history that has not yet finished being written because the people it most concerns, the survivors of Civitella, the families of the missing soldiers, the researchers working through Soviet camp records in diminished archive access, are still living with its consequences. The question of how to frame the Hermann Göring Division in 2026 from the vantage point of this documentary, which has followed the formation from its 400-man police origins in February 1933 to its formal surrender near Dresden in May 1945, requires holding two incompatible truths simultaneously. The first truth is that the division was, by every conventional military metric, a competent and, in some theaters, exceptional armored formation. Its performance at Gela in July 1943, where it came within 800 meters of driving the American 1st Infantry Division back into the sea, was tactically brilliant. Its rearguard action through Sicily, conducted by Kampfgruppe Schmalz along the eastern Etna line, delayed the Allied advance for 38 days and enabled the evacuation of 39,569 German personnel across the Messina Strait. Its fighting in East Prussia in October 1944 where Fallschirm Panzer Division 1 Hermann Göring alone destroyed 99 tanks and 43 anti-tank units in 4 days, demonstrated that the Corps remained capable of high-tempo mechanized combat in the war's final year. These facts are documented and verifiable. The second truth is that the same formation, in the same theaters, operating under the same commanders, with the same insignia and the same cuff title and the same institutional identity, killed at least 2,500 Italian civilians in reprisal operations that exceeded the Wehrmacht's own reprisal guidelines. This fact is also documented and verifiable. The two truths do not cancel each other. They coexist. A history that presents only one of them is a history in service of someone's comfort. The name Hermann Göring, stitched in white on a dark band worn on the left sleeve just below the rank insignia, accumulated meaning across 12 years and across 5 theaters of war. It began as a mark of political loyalty to one of the Third Reich's founders, a man who had built his power on a police force he used to eliminate his political opponents in 1933. It became a mark of professional military identity. The soldier who wore it was telling the world that he belonged to an elite formation whose patron was the second most powerful man in Germany. It became, in Italy in 1944, a mark that survivors of certain Tuscan villages would associate with the most catastrophic morning of their lives. After 1945, it became an object of auction, a collectible, a material fragment of a history that its collectors process differently depending on what they know, or choose to know, about the history encoded in the fabric. The meaning of a name is determined not by those who give it, but by everything that is done under it. This is the quiet revelation that a 12-year examination of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division leaves behind. That institutional identity is moral identity, whether or not the institution's members choose to accept that accounting. The division wore the name. The name encompasses everything. The question carried forward, the one that an honest engagement with this history cannot answer and cannot stop asking, is whether the archival and judicial processes that have slowly, incompletely, and belatedly documented the division's crimes in Italy constitute something that can be called, without euphemism, accountability. By 2026, all the men who served in the Vesuve Alarm Company on the 29th of June 1944 are dead. The Italian military court sentences of 2012 were handed to men who did not serve in the Hermann Göring Division specifically, and who in any case were too elderly for any sentence to be meaningfully served. The German-Russian project, attempting to match Suchdienst files with NKVD camp records, operates under reduced archival access. The 340 open files remain open. The auction catalogs continue to be published. Civitella's memorial archive remains open to visitors, its photographs of the dead arranged with the specificity that grief requires. What the archive leaves behind, finally, is not resolution, but witness, a documented, cross-referenced, multi-sourced, legally affirmed, and still incomplete account of what a formation did and what was done in its name, preserved in institutions distributed across 5 countries, available to anyone willing to look across all of them at once, waiting for the history that holds both truths together to be written.